in the halls of power. Zach, at 1 o'clock, can you just kind of walk us through a little tick-tock here of what needs to happen? Because I know Bernie Sanders wants to be heard and Mike Lee wants to be heard before this thing passes. What can you tell us?
There'll be 2 votes at 1 o'clock that will really kick off the floor consideration for this $95 billion package that, as you mentioned, includes funding for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, as well as legislation that would force the divestiture of TikTok by its Chinese owner ByteDance or face a ban in the United States. That first vote at 1 o'clock, Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, it's a procedural vote essentially to try to table the whole shebang, which will likely fail. And then the second vote will really be the one to watch. That's the 60-vote cloture threshold, we call it. It's basically the motion to limit debate, to say, okay, we're ready to move on and go to final passage. Now, a very similar package did pass the Senate a couple of months ago by something like 70 votes, and will likely get something similar to that this time around. And so there's not as much suspense, but certainly an important vote to watch as they head toward final passage of what has been a long-running saga here on Capitol Hill of getting this foreign aid done.
All right, great primer here, Zach. Just to pick through each of these so our listeners and viewers know what to expect coming up here. That first motion, that first Republican motion, is attempting to accomplish what? Just table the whole thing, throw the whole bill out?
Exactly. As you can imagine, there are members of the Senate who oppose this package. About a quarter of them, actually more than half of Senate Republicans voted for an initial version of this, again, back in February. A package of a similar size, too, $95 billion, which, again, included many of the same components. And so there'll be Republicans who will say, let's slow this down. We want to vote on amendments. We want to make changes to it. We appreciate all the House has done to get this to us, but we have some thoughts on it. There's certainly some Republicans here in the Senate, as there are in the House, that are skeptical of more aid for Ukraine, for instance. And so you could see a split there, members who want to slow things down at that point. But it does sound like there is at least a majority, and likely a substantial majority, of senators who do want to get this bill done, especially after Iran's attack on Israel. That has really created a lot of the political pressure to get this bill done, because you know, that Israel package has been combined with the Ukraine portion at this point, and has been for months.
You mentioned that 70 vote count last time when the Senate did this back in February. We've wasted basically a lot of time here, Zach, because this bill looks a lot like that one did, without the border compromise attached. But it does have something that the Senate bill did not, and that's the divest or ban TikTok component here. It's in the so-called sidecar. And we know that senators, in many cases, were very wary about passing this as a standalone. What are you hearing as they face the prospect of voting to divest or ban TikTok at the risk of funding for Ukraine and Israel?
The real conflict at this point on the TikTok bill, according to Senate Commerce Chair Maria Cantwell, who was seen as one of the obstacles to that TikTok bill from passing the Senate, was it actually increases the length of time that it gives ByteDance to divest from TikTok. And it goes from 6 months in the original bill to 1 year, which she thought would be enough time to find a new buyer, potentially, in the U.S. or elsewhere, at least not a Chinese buyer, which would eliminate some of the national security concerns that TikTok has raised with lawmakers. Banning TikTok from federal devices, for instance, Capitol Hill employees, Biden administration employees already can't have TikTok on their phones. This bill would go a lot farther and would actually say no American devices can have TikTok on them as long as ByteDance is still the owner. So now that length of time, that time frame between when the bill would be enacted and when the ban or forced divestiture would go into effect, once that's been extended, that has allowed the bill to look pretty good for prospects here in the Senate.
Fascinating. Zach, what's the timeline today? What are you hearing at least? We get this done today, or are we back tomorrow?
It could slip until tomorrow. It could be very late tonight. Not to get into too much of the weeds, but this 60-vote cloture threshold basically sets 30 hours maximum of debate, but one senator can't hold up all of it. They only get an hour each. And so it depends on how many senators at this point want to try to slow this bill down as long as possible, raise the debate, whether it be about the Ukraine portion if you're a Republican, or if you're Senator Bernie Sanders, the independent from Vermont, wants to talk about some of the offensive weaponry that he opposes, including in this package, given how Israel's conducted its war in Gaza since the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. They want to try to drag out that debate, but there's enough members who want to get back to recess, which is supposed to be going on this week, go to see their constituents, go to see their families, and I imagine you see a lot of that time yielded back. And so we'll know in the next couple of hours what the timeline looks like, but it could be a very late night here on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Well, you know I love getting into the weeds, Zach. That's why we love pulling you in here. It's good to see you. Zach Cohen, good luck tonight. You might need a little caffeine, it sounds like. Bloomberg Government's Congress reporter. Zach Cohen with us live here on Balance of Power. So, you know, by the time we go to bed tonight, I guess we'll have a pretty good sense of this, but it won't be lasting beyond tomorrow, and the president has promised to sign this. So it does seem, while we have to go through the motions, we've got to clear a couple of hurdles here. The die has been cast. And I'm curious what Bob Inglis thinks about all of this, watching from afar in South Carolina. Former Republican congressman, he's now executive director of Republican, EN.org. And Congressman, it's great to have you with us today on Balance of Power. I want to back up just a day and talk about what happened in the House. Actually, it's a couple days. Forgive me at this point. It was over the weekend when Mike Johnson actually brought these 4 bills to the floor, got them passed in the face of a threat to fire him. Is he going to end up looking like the smartest guy in the room, cutting these into separate pieces, getting them passed, shipping it to the Senate in basically the same form that Joe Biden asked for months ago? All the while, it seems like he's keeping his job. Bob, what do you see?
Yeah, I think probably so. And, you know, it's really sort of us as Americans recognizing the gift we've got in our history. You know, in that chamber that Senator Speaker Johnson presides over, there are only 2 portraits. One of is George Washington, of course. The other is a Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman who helped George Washington and who helped bring in the French into the fight that we were having with the British. If it weren't for the French help, we wouldn't have made it. And so it's sort of appropriate that that's right now in the House chamber. Those 2 portraits are hanging, and that's what's happening. We are helping a startup called Ukraine fight a world power called Russia. And so it's really us coming to recognize our history and our obligation to history to sort of repay the favor.
I love the optics that you're painting there. What happened to Mike Johnson over the past couple of months? Was it the classified intelligence briefings, was the meetings with foreign leaders, or was it just getting cover from Donald Trump in the end that brought him to this point?
You know, I think it is a fascinating thing, because I think what it is a study in leadership. What happens is, you know, when you don't have any real authority or power, you can just sound off and say all kinds of things. But when you realize, oh my gosh, I've got power here, I really need to act responsibly. And I think that's what Mike Johnson has done. He's acted responsibly. And it's the sort of the growing up that happens when somebody actually comes out of the hinterlands and into real power. He's got real power. He's a Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he's making the House function the way it should, which is put it on the floor, let the people's representatives vote, and let's see how it goes. And interestingly enough, it went with a lot of Democrat and Republican agreement. And then there's some people that disagree. That's fine. They get to hear we get to hear them. But leadership requires real thought and carrying through on things that matter.
I'm really taken by how many people are offended by that. Congressman threatening to fire the speaker over this. We keep hearing from people coming on this program talking about a coalition government that we now have. We're all going to be speaking with English accents here at some point. What do you make of that? Is it a coalition government, or is it just a functioning government?
Well, it wouldn't be. I think it's a functioning government, and I think if you ask most Americans, they'd say, isn't that great? I mean, you do have activists on both sides, on the left and on the right. And the problem really that we're having as Americans finding solutions to things like climate change, for example, is that the politicians have to play to those activists. And those activists, they really don't want solutions. They just want to sound off. And so most Americans actually want solutions. And, you know, in climate change, for example, the water is coming up. They want a solution. And so is it going to really help you if somebody's sounding off way over on the left or sounding off way over on the right? No, it's not going to help you at all. The water's coming up.
You had a break with your party when it comes to the issue of climate change. What's next? We're going to see Mike Johnson bring a climate bill to the floor?
That'd be great, wouldn't it? Because really, that'd be terrific. That's the kind of leadership that we would expect when somebody grows up, and I think he is growing up. And I'm impressed. I don't really know him, but I'm very glad for what I'm seeing. And I think I've seen it before, and we'll see it again. Is that once people get power and are actually called on to perform a valid function, rather than act like one of these bomb throwers. They don't have any power. All they do is just talk to media outlets and generate money for themselves in their own campaigns. That's not leadership. And so it's really great to see the House functioning.
Sounds like you miss it. The thing is, Mike Johnson's got a big bodyguard who walks everywhere with him in the schoolyard right now, and that's Donald Trump. Donald Trump can be pretty volatile about the way he feels about people. What happens when he wakes up one morning and decides this isn't worth it?
Yeah, I don't know. That's what I wonder if he'll ever grow up, frankly, and whether he'll ever realize, hey, you know what? You had power for those 4 years. You could have done something with it. But you know, I don't know. I think it's not his shtick. His shtick seems to be more to just play to a crowd that and take a bow and feed his personality needs. But, you know, maybe he could grow up. I don't know. But we as Americans need to insist on leaders growing up and saying, listen, well, we want solutions. We don't want all this talk. We want solutions. And it really is incumbent upon us. You know, most people say Congress doesn't listen to us. Actually, they do. They listen very carefully. And what they've heard us saying is from the activists, the left-wing activists, the right-wing activists, we want you to go up there and rail against the other side. Oh, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Don't worry, we don't need you to do anything. But if we told them, no, we need you to do something, they'd do it.
All of that said, if you were still on the House floor, would you expect Democrats to vote to protect Mike Johnson if it came to it?
Yes. And that will be the test of whether the Democrats are growing up. And it really is a crucial test. I thought they should have done that in the case of Kevin McCarthy, and they did not. So now they've got a chance to show that, no, really, they do put the country first. And in this case, it's up to them. It will be up to them because of the very small margin on the Republican side. So it is incumbent on Democrats to grow up and to say, hey, this is about the country and us fulfilling our obligations as really stewards of that message of freedom that France helped us with, and we won. Now Ukraine's doing that, and we need to help them against this Russian thing. And so it really is a moment for Democrats to decide, country or partisanship, and do you really want to throw the country into chaos with another speaker election that'll go on forever? Really? Is that what you want to do? Or do you want to accept the reality, oh, this is sort of a consensus government? And what's wrong with that?
I think we just spawned a new segment, Growing Up with Bob Inglis. Let's do this again, Bob, the former congressman from South Carolina, republican.org. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The stocks are racing in the green, counting down to the start of earnings from the high-flying cohort we know as the Magnificent Seven. The first to report that comes after the close of regular trading in New York today, that would be Tesla. Ahead of that, those shares right now up over 2%. In fact, all of the seven stocks, they're up ahead of the earnings reports for the Mag 7. Now, keep in mind the Tesla shares, they've been battered up to this point. The earnings we've already received include the conglomerate Danaher. It's helping power the S&P 500 higher. Its shares are up over 7%. And then you have Globe Life also doing some of the heavy lifting today. That's up 12%. The insurance company raising its operating earnings per share forecast for the full year. S&P 500 right now, that is up 56 points. That's a rise of 1.1%, 5,067 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 238 points. That's a rise of 0.6%. And the Nasdaq Composite Index right now up 234 points. That is up 1.5%. The two-year yield 3 basis points lower. That's at 4.93. The 10-year down 2 basis points. That yield is at 4.58. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues right now with Joe Matthew.
John Tucker, thank you. We'll be back with John a little bit later on this hour to keep tabs on trading for you, as you can expect every day here on Bloomberg Radio. Thanks for joining, whether you're listening on the radio, on the satellite, or on YouTube, where we always invite you to find us. Search Bloomberg Global News. You'll find our live stream. Let it rip. Great to have you with us here as we anticipate voting next hour. We're about a half an hour away from the actual business of the Senate to begin on this foreign aid package. Fair warning, procedural stuff. We've got to go through a couple of motions first. It is expected to be a very late night in the Senate, unless, of course, this bleeds into tomorrow when it comes to funding for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, the TikTok thing. They're getting it all done today. And the president says he'll sign it when it reaches his desk. He's on his way to Tampa today. Joe Biden in Florida, campaigning in Florida. Maybe it says a lot about where we are in this race when we've got that much bandwidth here to leave the blue wall and campaign in Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump's home state, where Joe Biden, I mean, let's be honest, doesn't stand a chance of winning here. But he can deliver a message. And Florida is becoming what the Biden campaign is now calling ground zero for the MAGA blueprint. He'll be talking about abortion there today. Reproductive rights 2 weeks before the 6-week ban takes effect. All the while, Donald Trump in court today. Some pretty interesting moments here. We're talking about the gag order and testimony resuming here. David Pecker, the former National Enquirer guy, will talk later this hour with June Grasso about it. But interesting, Joe Biden is going to have an eye on Pennsylvania today, where it's primary day. This is obviously his home state, as we hear. And there's a question about how this is going to play for him. If you look at our swing state poll, Pennsylvania is a must-win, and it's going to be a fight for Joe Biden. But we're looking down ballot on this primary day, where we can always learn a lot. And I'm glad to tell you, there's nothing like a primary day when we can dig into the races with Greg Giroux, Bloomberg Government's Congress and Elections reporter. He eats and sleeps this stuff. Greg, it's great to see you. I want to pick through a couple of these races with you here. And I guess we'll start with the one that's not going to create any drama tonight. That's the Senate race. People need to be watching this because it will absolutely factor in to the balance of power in the Senate. But of course, we're already in the general election stages there, aren't we?
That's right. Yeah, Democratic Senator Bob Casey and his Republican challenger Dave McCormick are unopposed in the primary. They've been campaigning against each other pretty vigorously for months now. This is quite a reversal from the 2022 Senate election in Pennsylvania, when McCormick ran and lost a narrow Republican primary to the Donald Trump-endorsed celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz, who then lost to John Fetterman in one of those races that flipped from the only race that flipped from Republican to Democratic control and really gave Democrats that narrow Senate majority that they're defending today. I think the Casey McCormick race is going to be one of the handful of races that will determine the majority in the Senate.
Going to be an expensive one, too. A lot of people who listen to and watch this program, Greg, hear the name Scott Perry a lot. Chair at one time of the House Freedom Caucus. He's still as loud as the chair when it comes to so many issues in the House of Representatives that have been debated, including Ukraine funding. Democrats think they might have an opportunity here. And you've got a candidate, Janelle Stelson, and another, Mike O'Brien, who are battling it out. I know there are others in the field, but these seem to be the two front runners. They've each got endorsements from Washington. How should we watch this race tonight?
Yeah, Scott Perry is going to be an interesting race to watch in the fall. I think it really speaks to the enthusiasm that Democrats have, that there are 6 candidates running in the primary. No other Pennsylvania primary has more than 3. Though, as you note, I think there are 2 candidates who are sort of drifting to the top. Janelle Stelson has the sort of quote-unquote name ID as a longtime former TV broadcaster that a lot of first-time candidates would have to, pay millions of dollars and years to accumulate. So she has that kind of built-in advantage, the familiarity with the district, even though she lives just outside the district, which is something I think that Perry's going to try and exploit if she's the nominee. Then Mike O'Brien, he's a newcomer to the district. He's a former Marine fighter pilot. He has some endorsements from military groups and from labor unions. And I think those are the 2 candidates to watch tonight. This is the district that's in south central Pennsylvania. Unlike some other districts represented by the kind of rebellious Freedom Caucus members, like say, some of the rebellious Freedom Caucus members, Perry's district is only mildly Republican leaning. It's a district that Donald Trump only won by 4 points in 2020. And so Democrats think that Perry is too conservative for this district, whereas Perry's camp is certainly thinks he's more in line with what the district voters think.
Well, it's really interesting here. Stelson has the backing of the New Dem coalition and a couple of prominent Democratic lawmakers, but so does O'Brien. And as you mentioned, he's a Marine. He's been backed by Seth Moulton, also a Marine, Rep. Connor Lamb, a Democrat from Pennsylvania. He's also got more money. And if you try to knock off a former chair of the Freedom Caucus, is it a more powerful message to have a Marine Corps fighter pilot, Greg?
Well, that's certainly the argument that a lot of Democratic groups who are trying to advocate for more military veterans in Congress are doing. Perry is also a military veteran, so I think the people who support O'Brien think that O'Brien's military background kind of help offset maybe any advantages that Perry might have by, brandishing his own military service. So certainly that's the argument that the O'Brien, the pro-O'Brien forces are making. Stelson's side, she has a lot of endorsements as well. The New Dem coalition, which is sort of represents the center-left Democrats in the House, they're back her, and so is the organization Emily's List, which supports Democratic women who support abortion rights. And both O'Brien and Stelson have said that abortion rights and protecting in vitro fertilization will be among the top issues of contrast with Perry in the fall.
Talking with Greg Giroux from Bloomberg Government on this primary day in Pennsylvania. I want to ask you about Pennsylvania 12. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made her way all the way to Pittsburgh over the weekend to stump for Summer Lee. Greg, how important is this race?
It's definitely a primary to watch tonight. This is probably one of 2, competitive, potentially competitive primary challenges to an incumbent, the other being in southeastern Pennsylvania with Brian Fitzpatrick in the 1st district. But I think this 12th district race, which is in Pittsburgh, it's a very Democratic heavy district. And Summer Lee, who's a member of the strongly liberal bloc, kind of known as the Squad, which includes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Her primary challenger, Bhavini Patel, who's a local office holder in this district, says that she's too far left for the district and that the district needs a more mainstream Democrat who's going to be much more behind Joe Biden than, say, Summer Lee has been. Israel politics have come to play in this district as Summer Lee has voted against some of the resolutions and measures that have denounced Iran or supported Israel. Summer Lee called for an immediate ceasefire after the October 7th attacks in that region. So Israel politics are playing, although it is to be noted that the Super PAC aligned with AIPAC, which spent millions of dollars against Summer Lee in the 2022 race, is sitting out this race.
That's fascinating, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Greg. Can we learn from the outcome of this campaign? Because to your point, Lee's opposition to Israel funding is driving a lot of organizing on her behalf, and Patel has been getting money from pro-Israel donors. Is this a microcosm for the nation?
I think it's one to start. I think we'll see several races where you have kind of members of the the far left members known as the Squad who have taken similar votes in Israel. I'd certainly like to see kind of a string of primaries like Cory Bush in Missouri, Jamal Bowman in New York. Those are all primary challenges to watch. Where I think you'll find a lot of these fault lines emerge that you're seeing. But yeah, this is really, I think, the first race where we're seeing kind of a serious primary challenge where Israel politics has really exposed some fissures in the Democratic Party.
Brian Fitzpatrick, lastly, Pennsylvania 1 has a challenge from his right, Greg. What should we know about this one?
Yeah, Fitzpatrick has the least party line voting record among the House Republican Conference. He's a rare moderate Republican in that body, and he breaks with his party mostly on environment and labor issues, but that really hasn't been a deal breaker for kind of the more MAGA Trump-aligned crowd, because Fitzpatrick didn't vote to impeach Trump, and he's sided with Republicans pretty loyally on immigration and crime issues. He'll typically lose a decent chunk of the primary electorate, more than 30% in his last two primaries. And I expect that to occur tonight, but I'd be very surprised if Fitzpatrick was unseated in the primary.
Yeah, a lot of people have heard from him on this program because he's got his name on this discharge petition that would have worked around Speaker Mike Johnson to bring Ukraine funding to the floor, but I guess we won't be needing to do that now. Greg, thanks as ever for the primer. It's great to see you, and find his full write-up here if you want to know what to watch tonight on the terminal and online at Bloomberg.com. Greg Giroux, he knows what he's talking about. Congress and elections reporter at Bloomberg Government. Happy primary day, Greg. We'll have a lot more to talk about on this front tomorrow. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next after we get you up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Columbia University's main campus has switched to hybrid learning for the rest of this semester amid protests over Israel's war with Hamas roiling colleges across the country. University officials say they based their decision on ensuring the safety for students, faculty, and staff.
It's just hard to see that we have reached such a point where we can't talk to each other. We can't interact in normal ways that we should be able to interact.
Students have been protesting Israel's war in Gaza at many campuses across the country in recent weeks. The Senate is returning to Washington. They're going to vote on that $95 billion in war aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
A few days ago, the House of Representatives at long last approved essential national security funding for Ukraine, for Israel, for the Indo-Pacific, and for humanitarian assistance. Today is the Senate's turn to act.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Donald Trump in a New York courthouse, day 2 of testimony in his criminal trial. Speaking from a hallway in a Manhattan courthouse, Trump made note of today's primary in a key swing state.
It's important to vote to let them know that we're coming on November 5th. We're coming big. Today is preliminary, but still it's very important.
Trump is required to attend the election interference trial, largely sidelining him from the presidential campaign trail. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Tesla is going to kick off earnings for the Magnificent Seven. That comes after the close of regular trading today. Tesla expected to report its first quarterly sales drop since the start of the pandemic. It's also seen posting the steepest earnings per share decline year over year in the Magnificent Seven. This is according to estimates compiled by Bloomberg Intelligence. Well, ahead of that, stocks, they're pushing higher for the moment. All the major averages are up. 10 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 higher. You have NVIDIA shares leading the semiconductor stocks. NVIDIA shares right now up 3.1%. That stock says for rates, swaps are showing roughly even odds for 1 or 2 Fed interest rate cuts this year. Andrew Hollenhorst at Citigroup Global Markets still believes the bar's pretty low for Fed rate cuts.
We've had these 3 stronger core inflation prints, but what we bring it back to is this idea that inflation is higher. We think it is structurally higher, but it is also more volatile. And if it's more volatile, it means we're going to get some stronger prints, we're going to get some softer prints. We've had some stronger prints, we're probably going to see some softer prints, and that will be enough.
We did get a softer print. The business activity expanding in April at the slowest pace this year. You saw a pullback in demand, and that helps the view the Fed will have to cut at some point. S&P 500 right now up 60 points. That's a rise of 1.2%, 5,071 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 263 points at 38,503. And the NASDAQ Composite Index, that's up 240 points, a rise of 1.5%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues right now with Joe Matthew.
John Tucker, thank you. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Did I say it was Wednesday earlier? It's only Tuesday?
It feels like Wednesday.
We could actually get it all done in the Senate. What's that, John? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's got a Wednesday feel to it, like midweek.
I guess it does.
Filling in for Charlie, you know, it just like goes so fast.
I'm sure that's true. Where every day is Friday for Charlie Pellet. There's going to be some voting today. We're going to get into this in about 20 minutes. Procedural voting, everyone will be freaking out about this when the real vote could be late tonight. We'll find out if they're pulling out the cots or if they come back tomorrow. Everybody wants to get home, and this does seem to be pretty much all said and done, with the exception of a bit of procedure and a bit of debate here from both the left and the right that will satisfy everybody before we get down to business. We'll keep you posted. It'll likely transpire in our second hour here. Like I said, starts about 20 minutes from now. We've got our eyes on the courthouse in Lower Manhattan as well, with the headline on the terminal: Trump may lose contempt fight as judge calls arguments silly. To think of what's going through the mind of the former president here as they review the gag order here, and Judge Merchan running out of patience for claims the gag order preventing Donald Trump from disparaging witnesses, and I guess the judge for that matter, or the jury, was somehow vague. He says, "You have been unable to present anything. I have asked you to prove this point." And we're getting back into testimony now. David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer, is describing this catch and kill scheme that they had going. We don't have cameras in the courtroom, but we do have reporters in the courtroom who are giving us live play-by-play on what is being said. As Pecker describes receiving phone calls from Michael Cohen, he'd say, "We'd like you to run a negative article on a certain, let's say, Ted Cruz." He would send me info about Ted Cruz or Ben Carson or Marco Rubio. That was the basis of our story. And we would embellish it from there. Let's assemble our panel. Rick Davis is with us, Republican strategist, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, joined today by Pat Dennis, president and founder, American Bridge 21st Century, Democratic strategist. Great to see you both. Rick, are we now at the point where this story is working against Donald Trump politically?
Yeah, I would say in a number of different ways. One, I think press-wise, these are all negative stories, right? There's no positive story coming out of this for Donald Trump. So, you know, when polling takes place, you ask people about the inflows of information. Are you hearing anything good? You hearing anything bad? And, you know, I suspect pollsters are going to start seeing almost all the information you hear about Donald Trump is bad. That being said, you also have him off the campaign trail. I mean, as a campaign manager, I mean, you count every single day you can be in Michigan. How many days can we be in Arizona? You fight with the fundraisers. No, he can't go to more, fundraising events in New York. I got to have him in, Michigan. So every day he spends in that courthouse, it's totally non-productive for his campaign as far as building coalitions, talking to independent voters, dominating the state media. So, I mean, yes, it is as a political decision, it's a disaster.
Pat, all the while, Joe Biden's going to Tampa. And I wonder how you see this. How do you frame all of this with Donald Trump locked in a courtroom, as Rick Davis just aptly described here, and Joe Biden's going to states he can't even win, just to deliver a message, what the campaign calls ground zero for Trump's MAGA blueprint. He's going to Florida instead of another blue wall state today. What should that tell us?
Well, I'm going to agree with Rick that all the politics are bad for Trump out of the courtroom. It seems like, Trump, he's falling asleep. I think we should also mention he's having outbursts. He can't handle what he's posting on social media. It seems like he's kind of more due for a parent-teacher conference than anything else. But getting back to Florida, I wouldn't be so quick to say that it can't be won. You used to be able to afford a house in Florida, afford property insurance. You didn't have to worry that every single person you met on the street was carrying a gun. And these are all things that extreme MAGA agenda has sort of put into place there. And I think with the implosion of Ron DeSantis, you're really seeing the bloom come off the rose with this kind of politics. And the abortion stuff, the abortion extremism is really the epicenter of that. And it's something we need to be talking about.
Well, there was a long time, of course, we talked about Florida as a swing state, Florida and Ohio. Aren't we in a different world now, Rick? Could Joe Biden win Florida? I thought they loved Ron DeSantis.
I wouldn't be spending a lot of capital on Florida. If you got money to burn, sure, see if you can put it in play. The abortion referendum is certainly going to get the Democrats' attention. It's not bad for turnout. And I think Pat's right. I mean, one of the pillars of the Republican Party there, Ron DeSantis, is a broken model now, right? I mean, how many times do we talk about wokeness lately? Zero. How many times has Disney come up? None. All these things that he sort of campaigned on last time around is no longer an issue to voters in Florida or outside of Florida. So the reality is maybe there's a little bit opening, but I wouldn't waste a lot of candidate time and money in a state that has the track record it currently has. And by the way, many better prospects in Florida. North Carolina comes to mind. A lot of the similar dynamics that exist there in a much more competitive state for Democrats.
Enter the Natural Law Party. Pat, I don't mean to be a wise guy here, but sometimes I can't help it. And I'm just trying to figure out what's happening in Michigan here. RFK Jr. getting on the ballot through the Natural Law Party, which, and I've been to their website, they describe themselves as the fastest growing political party in America. There's a 50-point plan if you want to know what their platform is. And if you start reading through it, you might end up with a lot of questions by the time we're done. But I'm told that this could actually lose Michigan for Joe Biden. Do you agree?
I agree. It's a real concern. I agree that this Natural Law Party, look, not to get too far out there, but they're like a scam to get ballot access. If you look at the interviews with the people, they've basically been sitting on this thing looking for a candidate that they could hand over ballot access to. It's basically RFK's only chance of getting onto this stuff. And I don't know if their policy platform has 15-week national abortion ban or, fake environmentalism where you own oil wells, conspiracy theories that are the actual RFK platform. But it's a real concern. And the fact that he's using these loopholes so aggressively really bothers me. But ultimately, we just need to tell people who this guy is. Kennedy's entire family has come out against him, which I think people really understand is a sign if the people who know you best are saying, don't vote for this guy.
Then again, Rick, we keep hearing that RFK Jr. might take more votes away from Donald Trump. So I'm trying to figure this out. The knock on no labels was you can't get on the ballot in all 50 states, so you're not real. You're a spoiler. And it sounds like that applies to RFK Jr., but he's getting on some important ballots here. What should we think about this?
Yeah, Michigan is a big deal to the Biden campaign and potentially to the Trump campaign. I mean, in the Bloomberg survey from March in Michigan, we had in a two-way campaign, Trump beating Biden barely. I think it was really almost like dead even. And then you add Cornel West and you add Jill Stein and you add Kennedy, that's like 14% of the vote coming right off the top, and it's still dead even. So it's not totally clear to me, like, who's actually going to succeed in the sweepstakes to see whether or not Kennedy hurts or helps somebody. We talked a little bit yesterday even about how in some of the national polls, it shows that Kennedy's actually drawing more from Trump base than he's drawing from Biden. So I think the jury's going to be out for that. But Joe Biden really needs Michigan, and he has lots of fundamental problems there, including a very irritated Democratic Arab base in the state, 300,000 Arab Americans who have absolutely gone berserk over the Biden policy toward Israel. And so if I were Joe Biden, I'd spend less time in Florida and more time in Michigan, because he's not going to win Florida, but he better win Michigan.
I suspect that he's going to be back again and again and again. We've certainly seen him do that in Pennsylvania, but we'll have more to talk with our panel coming up in our second hour here on Balance of Power. Great conversation with Rick Davis and Pat Dennis, and we'll have a lot more on that. Kaylee Lyons will join the conversation, as well as we welcome our global television audience, just like every day here on the fastest show in politics, The Post on Truth Social. The Truth, as they call them. Donald Trump, quote, highly conflicted, all caps here. To put it mildly, Judge Juan Merchan has taken away my constitutional right to free speech. Everyone, he goes on to write, is allowed to talk and lie about me. But I am not allowed to defend myself. This is a kangaroo court, and the judge should recuse himself, exclamation point, end of quote. June Grasso's covering this every day now. This is her life. The first criminal trial of a former president.
Isn't it?
Listen, this is what we have you for here, June. What's going to happen with this gag order? Did we learn anything today?
Well, we learned that the judge didn't buy any of the arguments that the defense was putting forward. I mean, he yelled, he scolded Trump's lawyer at one point. He said, you're losing credibility with the court, and I asked the questions here. So it was apparently a bruising encounter for Trump's defense lawyer, because he was saying, well, you know, Trump has a right to respond. These are political responses, and he can respond when his adversaries attack him, which is really not what the gag order doesn't say. Oh, exception if you're responding because it's political. And what I thought was funny is the prosecutor went through all the different, like 11 different posts. They could have just played a tape of Trump outside the court yesterday where he mentioned Cohen.
Yes,
he mentioned that he was a lawyer, a bad lawyer, and he talked about his past troubles with the taxi medallions. I mean, I don't know if there's any way to stop him. The prosecutors didn't even ask to have him jailed because I guess they knew that was not going to happen. But how do you stop him? I don't know.
Well, so what are we talking about here, June? Prosecutors say Trump violated the gag order at least 10 times. We're not going to jail, right? Is this going to be some kind of a fine or a slap on the wrist? How does the judge handle it?
So, you know, I think that it's going to be a slap on the wrist. I think he's going to try to maybe to talk to Trump and to try to outline what's allowed and what's not allowed. I mean, they argued today that his reposting somebody else's tweet or, you know, X, whatever we call it, is not the same as him posting. And the judge said, basically, that's just ridiculous. You know, so I think he'll outline some of that and hope for the best until something happens that perhaps leads to another juror being excused from the jury. It's very difficult for the judge here because he has to balance the First Amendment right, which Trump keeps talking about. You mentioned it in the Post. He has a First Amendment right to speak. He thinks whatever he wants to say, which is, of course, not the First Amendment. But he has to balance that with the, you know, protecting the witnesses, protecting the jurors, and making sure that the trial goes forward in a fair manner. But, I mean, today, I'm sorry to laugh, but Trump's lawyer said, we're not getting a fair trial here. You know, there's a two-tiered system, and the judge said, a two-tiered system in this court? I don't know. They're swinging for the fences. I guess they're hoping for appellate issues. But the judge is none too happy.
I'm getting that sense. We're getting back to testimony now.
And I haven't even read all the quotes yet.
June, Well, no, I know. This is going to be a fun listen on Bloomberg Law later on. It starts at 6 o'clock, so make sure you're with June on your drive home here. David Pecker is back to testimony. This is the former publisher of the National Enquirer, the owner of Catch and Kill, describing what it was like to get calls from Michael Cohen to squash a story on a politician or a famous person here. Just got a minute left. June, what else are we going to hear from him today?
Well, I think, they're going to go into what the prosecution is calling the conspiracy in which Pecker, Trump, and Cohen talked about, squashing these stories from Stormy Daniels. So you're going to hear the nitty-gritty of that. And, you're getting sort of a sense, and I'd love to be in the courtroom just to see the dynamic between Trump and Pecker, because apparently at the beginning, Pecker was not looking at Trump. Trump was glaring at him. I mean, these were former friends.
I bet.
These were former friends. The first call he got after he bought the National Enquirer was from Donald J. Trump saying what a great magazine it was. So there was a friendship there, and, things happen, and you don't want to go to prison, so you testify.
It must be cold in that courtroom. Donald Trump keeps saying, you know how cold it is in there? Would someone get him a sweater? June, thank you. I'm loving these daily check-ins with June Grasso. Make sure you hear Bloomberg Law, 6 p.m. Wall Street time, as we keep you posted on what's happening in the courtroom in Lower Manhattan. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
But will they need to set up the cots? Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As senators plan for a long day of debate and voting on the foreign aid bill to bring money to Ukraine and Israel, among other items that passed the House already. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. And Kaylee, this could be a very late night for senators. Yeah. But first, we need to clear a couple of important procedural hurdles, and it's all about to begin.
Yeah, it's supposed to begin at 1 p.m. However, a number of senators have decided to take the floor today for speeches, so it does seem we're a little delayed on the start of these procedural votes today, Joe. But it's not really a question of if this package is going to pass the Senate. Right now, it really is just a question of when, knowing there is recess time for them waiting on the other end of this vote. Certainly, most members probably are eager to get out of town. It's just a question of how long some of those few who would like to delay this process are willing to keep them here.
Yeah, we remind everyone that they're supposed to be on recess, so there is a motivation to get out of here. But look, there are voices, and if you're with us on YouTube and on Bloomberg TV, you see Senator Patty Murray on the floor right now. There are voices, Kaylee, from the left and the right who want to be heard, and what some are describing as a last-minute spasm here of politics before an inevitable vote. The question is, will that happen in the wee hours, or do they come back tomorrow? That's what we'll find out together.
Indeed, and it's worth keeping in mind that the U.S. Senate already passed a very similar passage vote to what they're going to be voting on today, with 70 votes in favor. So again, it's highly likely that this gets through. It's just a question of when, and we will continue to keep you updated on the progress throughout this hour. First, though, as always, we've got to start with a check on the markets, and for that, we turn to John Tucker up in New York. Hey, John.
Hey, Kaylee. The major stock averages pushing higher again today after yesterday's close. A flood of earnings reports that is dictating much of the trading that we're seeing today. After the close today, the first of the stocks that we know collectively is the Magnificent Seven. They opened their books. We're talking about Tesla here. Those shares right now up close to 3%. 10 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500, they are higher right now, being led by communication services and the industrials. You have NVIDIA shares. They are up 2.6%. They are leading the rest of the semiconductor stocks higher today. Danaher, one of the stocks lifting the S&P 500, it reported stronger profit for the first quarter, stronger than what analysts were looking for, and General Motors topping forecast. That is thanks to the sales of pickup trucks and other higher margin vehicles. Overall, the S&P 500 right now is up 54 points. That's a rise of just over 1%. We're at 5,065 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 237 points, and the NASDAQ Composite Index 221 points higher. That is up 1.4%. And yields, they're pushing lower. Two-year yield right now down 5 basis points. That's at 491. The 10-year, the benchmark, 3 basis points lower. That is at 457. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power resumes right now with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, John Tucker, thank you very much. Joe and myself in watch and wait mode as we keep an eye on the Senate floor, waiting for these procedural votes to kick off. We need a cloture vote first, Joe. 60 members need to vote yes for forward progress. Ultimately, we'll get to final package. We just don't know quite when we will get to the final passage of this package. $95 billion in aid to U.S. allies, and of course, a divest or ban bill for TikTok in question today.
Yeah, they stitched them all together. Separate votes in the House and now one big block here for the Senate. To your point, this must be deja vu for a lot of these senators. They already voted on this. Basically, that was back in February. Remembering that was considered DOA in the House at the time. They basically rebuilt that entire bill, put all the pieces back together, and now senators are asked again. So while this is procedural, we're going to look closely at the cloture vote to get a sense of how close it might come to that 70 threshold that we saw last time. Megan Scully is leading our coverage on this, as always, here in Washington in our Bloomberg Bureau. Congressional News team leader. Megan, it's great to see you. Thanks. I mentioned pulling out the cots later. Is it one of those nights, or do we end up coming back tomorrow? Because these guys want to go home, right?
They do want to go home, and the jet fumes always powerful motivator, like I say. We're hearing late evening tonight, which could mean 7 p.m. or 11 p.m., but it seems like it will be before sunrise. So.
Okay.
Okay, well, there you go. Of course, we may have a few amendments to get through first. Stephen Dennis, who, of course, is our Senate whisperer here at Bloomberg, says that they're scheduled now at 1:15 to vote on Senator Mike Lee's amendment. That's an effort that is almost certain to fail. Basically, all of these amendment votes, Megan, are likely to fail. But I guess it's just you got to be seen in the act of trying if you're these senators.
Yes, it's essentially part of the deal to get this. Believe it or not, this is an expedited process that the Senate is undergoing. It could drag out for a few more days. So in order to get this agreement, this time agreement, they had to agree to allow these conservative Republicans to offer amendments that, as you said, will fail. If they were to pass, that would cause huge problems because then it would have to go back to the House for amendment, but we are not expecting that.
Are we hearing hemming and hawing about TikTok? Or everyone is kind of hiding behind the fact that this has been extended to up to a year for divestiture? Because there were a lot of senators not prepared to vote to pass that when it was a standalone bill.
Sure. So Senator Cantwell of Washington, who's chairwoman of the Commerce Committee, a lot of the changes that she had asked to be implemented, including the longer time for the divestiture, were implemented in the House bill. So she is now on board with it. So we're expecting to see pretty much, strong support across both parties with the, outliers, like Senator Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee.
Could this actually get more than the 70 votes this very similar package garnered the first time around? Could we actually see that bipartisan majority expanding when this vote finally happens?
We could. I haven't run the numbers exactly, but there's certainly something in here for just about everyone to like, which is why it passed the House in those sort of in parts, yes. And so with the Senate voting on it in one comprehensive bill, if you support Israel, if you support Gaza, if you support Ukraine, there's something in there for you to vote for.
We're hearing the term coalition government on the daily now, in this program at least. It's not a formal power sharing agreement, but with what we have seen over the past couple of days with Mike Johnson, is it worth that type of framing, or is this just a bipartisan government working and no one recognizes it?
I think it is a bipartisan government working, and this is how Congress should work. We just haven't seen it work this way in quite some time. And what you saw happen in the House, while very unusual, getting Democrats on board to push this bill through on over various procedures that ultra-conservatives were opposing, that's deal making. That's kind of good old-fashioned deal making that we just don't see happen in Washington very often anymore.
Well, and if you listen to Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, she maybe wouldn't like to see that continue happening because she thinks Mike Johnson is essentially rolling over for the Democrats and may still very well pursue this motion to vacate for that reason. And yet we did hear once again from former President Donald Trump, who was speaking on a radio show yesterday talking about he thinks Mike Johnson's a good guy. He has a 1-vote margin, trying to kind of paint the picture of the reality it is that Republicans are working with. If Trump's not on board with the motion to vacate, can Marjorie Taylor Greene realistically move forward with it?
I think it's very difficult. She's obviously very close to the former president. So I don't see her moving forward without his tacit approval. Now, Trump can change his mind on somebody pretty quickly. Right. We've seen that happen in the last 7 years. So we'll see what plays out over the next few weeks. But as of right now, he's standing pretty steadfastly behind the speaker. I would say his comments yesterday were even stronger than the comments he made at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you're in for a long night, it seems, Megan. Thank you very much for spending some of this day
with us. Bring in the pizzas for the Congress team.
Pizza, caffeine, bring it all. Megan Scully leads our congressional coverage here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. Now, of course, Joe, we've talked extensively about what the ultimate passage of this bill will specifically mean for Ukraine's war effort. Immediately, as the Biden administration says, they're all set up to get things quickly onto the ground for the Ukrainian war effort. But it's also an Israeli war effort that the U.S. is attempting to support here with nearly $20 billion in aid to Israel as part of this package. And that is on the note. We turn now to Hagar Shamali. She is former national security, formerly with the National Security Council, now the founder of Greenwich Media Strategies. She also is an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Hagar, it's always great to have you. What will these billions of dollars in aid for Israel immediately do to the ongoing conflict we are seeing Israel engaged in with, frankly, not just Hamas, but other Iranian proxies, including recently Iran itself?
Sure. Well, the way anybody should view U.S. aid to Israel is in the context of qualitative military edge, maintaining and supporting their qualitative military edge. That means, in normal speak, that we're trying to ensure that Israel always has the upper hand when it comes to defense in the region. We know they're surrounded by enemies, and our non-NATO alliance that dates back to 1987, that is the agreement ultimately, is that we work to maintain their qualitative military edge, not that we try to promote certain behavior. And so what that's going to do in this case, on one hand, it's going to allow them in general, from the 60,000 foot level, to continue their operations inside Gaza. On the flip side, you're going to have as well, it's going to be coupled with dialogue and talks on the United States side that will communicate their concerns to the Israeli government in terms of their military strategic approach inside Gaza. So on one hand, you have that. And on the other, you have a lot of it in particular that's going to go to the Iron Dome and to the other defensive systems that Israel maintains, especially following what you saw coming from Iran only a couple of weeks ago.
Hagar, just in the past couple of days, we've seen a few remarkable headlines coming out of Israel. The head of Israel's military intelligence unit has resigned, and there's reporting that the U.S. State Department is now preparing to announce sanctions against a battalion within the IDF for human rights violations. Considering the very strained relationship that we've talked about already between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu leading up to this moment, how would you describe this moment we're in now?
It's a little weird. I'm not going to lie to you. That's the only term I can think of. When I saw the news saying that the Biden administration was preparing sanctions on this one unit within the IDF, it's not that I approve at all in any way what that particular unit is doing. That unit, as far as I understand, is a unit that is manned or comprised of far-right Orthodox individuals who have been previously accused of human rights abuses in the West Bank. Fine. But Israel is an ally, and so when you have a problem or concern or you vehemently oppose something that an ally is doing, typically you hammer that out in conversation, in dialogue. And that's why I find it a weird use of the sanctions tool. Now, sanctions in this regard, what ends up happening, if you sanction that one unit, that not only means that the United States is not able to give weaponry to that unit, and they will prove that, they will have to continue proving that, but the onus will also fall on the Israeli military and government to also prove that, or ensure that no weaponry that is U.S. weaponry is going to that unit. So on that front, I can support what the U.S. is trying to achieve. I think I understand the broader goal. I understand it because the U.S. is trying to say, hey, that unit and in general settler activity in the West Bank undermines U.S. national security objectives because we see a two-state solution as the long-term sustainable solution to this conflict, and this settler activity directly undermines that goal. I agree with all of that. I just find sanctions are a bit of an aggressive tone to take at this stage when Israel is in the middle of all this. At this time to take toward this. I would have rather seen that handled in private conversations, even publicly, by the way, is fine. And as the war dies down, if it remains a problem, then you sanction them, fine. And then you've made your point loud and clear. But at this time, it just further highlights the strain that you're seeing and puts it out in the open.
Yeah, well, we've seen a lot put out in the open publicly, Hagar, including what was escalating tension between Bibi Netanyahu and President Biden, specifically over the issue of Rafah, as the U.S. pushes Israel not to potentially put at risk the lives of the million-plus Palestinians that are there. But now, especially that it seems the immediate direct conflict with Iran may have been wrapped up at this time for Israel. Should we expect that it is Rafah next and potentially soon?
Well, the airstrikes on Rafah have already begun on the part of Israel. And what's interesting, and I'm glad you're covering it, because given what you had with Iran and certainly given what you're having now with protests here across the nation and at universities, including the university I teach at, the focus seems to be on that and not the fact that things are continuing in Gaza, in particular the airstrikes on Rafah. Now, you have airstrikes on Rafah, but we haven't seen this kind of full-scale invasion and operation that we've all been waiting for or anticipating, but inevitably it's going to go down that road. I believe it will go down that road. The Israeli government claims that they're going to be evacuating citizens, but we haven't seen it yet. And so it remains a bit murky, at least from the public view, as to where the Israeli military is headed with Rafah. Clearly, they've made a decision to go in. That is not surprising. They've said that. I never had any reason to doubt it. But at what point will they be evacuating citizens in order to ramp those operations up is unclear to me. That said, they have also said that that would indicate the end of their high intensity portion of the war. And so we are hopefully reaching an end to that at some point soon. But Rafah, I expect it to intensify further.
You've got members of the Senate, Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, calling on Joe Biden to send the National Guard into Morningside Heights. Can you talk to us, Hagar, about how this is going to end on the campus of Columbia University and other campuses? We're coming up on the 4th of May, which is the anniversary of the Kent State shootings. This is very real right now.
Well, how it ends is very unclear, and I can say that with a lot of firsthand experience being an adjunct professor at Columbia right now. It is a very difficult situation on campus, and the administration is really grappling and struggling with its response, because on one hand, you had the response last week where they invited the New York Police Department to remove protesters after they had been repeatedly warned that they were in violation of rules, that they had no right to stay there, and that if they didn't move, they would be forcibly removed. And that's what happened, obviously. I was in support of that, because I believe a university it's a private institution, it's a private campus. And while students have the right to protest and exercise free speech, they don't have the right to violate Columbia rules and guidelines. And they certainly don't have the right to create a hostile environment for other students who are on campus whose main priority is to study and learn. And so they were removed. And that removal obviously has created this reaction where the encampment is back. The protests have now spread to other universities. And you can see the university now really grappling with, well, since that was a reaction to the police, do we double down on that, or do we dialogue with them? And that seems to be the approach they're taking now. They've allowed the protests. They've said that they're going to dialogue with the protesters. I can tell you that the protesters are not unified. Their demands are absurd. Some of their demands, at least. They're very disorganized. And so they come off extremely unserious in negotiations, because they're students, by the way, at the end of the day. But that they're going to dialogue with them. And at the same time, they shut things down to go virtual for classes, and offered escorts, for example, for Jewish students attending Seders. And that, to me, is wrong. Yeah. I don't understand, as a professor, why I should go virtual and my students, because certain students are creating...
Hagar, come back when we have more time. Hagar Shamali, this is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Equities heading toward their biggest back-to-back advance in 2 months. Earnings and economic reports looks like they're in the driver's seat for investors today. After the close of regular trading today, the first of the Magnificent Seven set to report. That's Tesla. And ahead of those earnings, its shares right now, they are up about 2.5%. Besides Tesla, Microsoft, Meta Platforms, Alphabet, they're also due to report earnings this week. NVIDIA shares right now, they're leading the semiconductor stocks higher. Shares of NVIDIA, they are up just about 3% right now. United Parcel Service, which is considered by many to be an economic barometer, reporting profit that beat estimates. And on the data front, U.S. business activity expanding in April at the slowest pace this year. So that gives fuel to the argument that the Fed is going to have to cut interest rates at some point this year. S&P 500 right now, that is up 57 points. That's a rise of 1.1% at 5,068. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 257 points higher. That's up 0.7%. And the Nasdaq Composite Index right now is up 235 points. That's about a 1.5% pop there. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues right now with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we're broadcasting live on Bloomberg and television and radio from the studio. Well, we also kind of wish we could be a fly on the wall in the U.S. Senate right now, because there's some debate happening on the floor, at least speeches on the floor. Right now, the independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, is talking about this $95 billion aid package that is getting set for a few procedural votes and ultimately eventually final passage. We expect later today or at some point Wednesday. Joe, we just had the Republican senator from Utah, Mike Lee, talking as well. What we're going to need to find here is some agreement on what amendments they're going to vote on and when, then a cloture vote, and then ultimately the real deal.
This is the sausage being made. This is the part you're not supposed to see, but we're showing it to you. Live from Washington here, procedural votes that will lead to real votes, and it might be really late tonight, Kaylee, maybe early in the morning. They're talking about whether to bring in the cots. They'll definitely be bringing in the fast food and the wine. You didn't hear it from me, but that's the way it goes around here. But yes, making an agreement here on how to use the floor time, satisfying members of both parties. In this case, Kaylee, you just walked through that pretty well. There are Democrats and Republicans who want to be heard today, but it is not expected to change the outcome of this vote, and that's what we want to talk about with our panel. Rick Davis is with us, Republican strategist, Bloomberg Politics contributor, joined today by Pat Dennis. Of course, back with us today, Democratic strategist and founder and president, American Bridge 21st Century. Great to see you both here. Rick, this is a foregone conclusion that these bills are going to pass. But what we're about to hear from the Mike Lees and Bernie Sanders of the world does tell us quite a lot about the debate around these bills, and that's not going to end when the president signs them, is it?
No, this convincing will continue on. People will continue to campaign on it. Look, it's a issue that the American public is relatively undecided about, right? They've been moving around quite a bit on issues related to Israel and to Ukraine. And so I think these members want to start staking out positions. They're headed into an election year, and they want to make sure that they get their bite in before the end of the weekend. But it's really a trading range on votes. Last vote on this was 70 votes in the Senate out of 100. It's plus or minus 3 or 4 votes, and I think that's where we're going to wind up tonight.
So as we're seeing some of these other senators taking some time on the floor, including Republican Senator Mike Lee, who we mentioned, we did hear on the floor earlier today, Pat, from Senator Mitch McConnell, who is the outgoing Senate minority leader. He, of course, will no longer retain that leadership position after the election, but he has been fighting the fight on getting Ukraine aid through this chamber, through Congress more broadly, loudly and vocally, sometimes in the face of serious opposition from members of his own party. We've talked a lot about how this package passing is a victory for President Biden, but is it too for Mitch McConnell?
Potentially. I mean, he's on his way out. It seems like he's sort of, maybe trying to work on some of the stuff he actually believes. But, to a large extent, the MAGA faction within the Republican Party can trace its roots and its power back to Mitch McConnell in a lot of ways. And those are the ones who really are the reason this bill is 6 months later than it should be, after, significant setbacks in Ukraine and people dying that didn't have to happen. And look, I'm glad we're getting this bill passed. I think Congress starting to work together and actually get some bipartisan stuff done is a testament to Joe Biden's leadership. And I'm hopeful it can continue.
Just said a name that I haven't heard anyone mention in a while, Pat, and that's Mitch McConnell. Rick Davis, what does Mitch McConnell do with this moment? Having stood his ground, and he's got something to show for it in this case, does he circle the wagons again? And I know that there's a battle here for the next leader, but while he's in charge, circle the wagons here and say, take this lesson. You might want to listen to your leader next time.
Yeah, I think that this is as much about his legacy as it is about the future. If there are two winners in this entire drama for the last 6 months around Ukraine funding, it's been Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden. Both have stood firm with their competing constituencies. Joe Biden certainly took a lot of gas from the left on his support for Israel, and Mitch McConnell has had to plow back the advancing populist MAGA Republican tide in the Senate by holding firm on this. And they can both really feel good about the fact that they've done something special. I would say, Mitch McConnell will probably not be remembered for what I think is one of the more historic achievements of the Senate, which is a bipartisan bill on this issue that included the strongest title we've had on border security in 30 or 40 years. And it wasn't MAGA in Senate that stopped that from happening. It got passed. It's the MAGA right in the and Donald Trump, really specifically, who deserves credit for killing that in the House. And we could actually be celebrating a really significant event here if they'd have kept that title in.
Well, Rick, you bring up former President Trump and the MAGA right in the House. We know some members of that faction of the Republican Party, namely Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, and Tom Massey, would like to see the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, potentially vacated or resign as a result of this foreign aid making it through that chamber. And yet it seems Donald Trump, for the second time, has stepped in to defend Mike Johnson. He was asked about him on John Frederick's media network last night, and this is what he had to say about the House Speaker. Take a listen.
It's a tough situation when you have one. I think he's a very good man. I think he's trying very hard. And again, we've got to have a big election. We've got to elect some people in Congress, much more than we have right now.
So, Rick Davis, is Donald Trump guaranteeing that Mike Johnson will stay the Speaker? Can Marjorie Taylor Greene go against the de facto leader of her party, someone who she's very close with?
Well, I actually don't think Donald Trump can guarantee it, but Hakeem Jeffries can, because he's got actual votes on the floor that would vote for Johnson. And I think Donald Trump only has votes that would vote against Johnson. Marjorie Taylor Greene wasn't going anywhere with her sort of showboat maneuver. Her performative, politics is exactly being laid bare now because there's nowhere for her to go. And even Donald Trump thinks it's a bad idea to have chaos in the House of Representatives right before an election. That didn't take much effort to think through that problem. So, yeah, I think that Donald Trump is only going where he thinks is the safest place for him to go right now, and that's backing Speaker Johnson. But, he backed Speaker McCarthy before throwing him to the wolves. So I wouldn't get too far along on my victory lap if I were Speaker Johnson right now.
Throwing him to the wolves, indeed. Look, we've got a lot to witness left today, and if you're just joining us on Bloomberg Radio and TV, the process has begun in the Senate. We're actually watching a roll call vote take place now on a motion to table, to kill this entire package that passed the House and was stitched back together again here in the Senate. It is expected to pass this bill despite the efforts to change it or kill it along the way, and it might come hours from now. It might come a lot later. All the while, Donald Trump, aforementioned, is in court today in New York for what was another half day, and Joe Biden is in Tampa campaigning Pat Dennis, how does Joe Biden leverage the momentum coming off of this? We're all talking about Mike Johnson and his political win, his political future. How does the president ride this to his benefit on the campaign trail?
I mean, ultimately, what is to the American people's benefit is to Joe Biden's benefit. You have steady leadership. He's getting this stuff passed. People forget, but, Donald Trump was trying to get aid passed to Ukraine and wound up trying to extort our friends and ultimately got impeached over it, which is, kind of a big deal. I think what you see Joe Biden doing in Florida, though, is really showing the contrast between these policies where, Congress is doing stuff that actually works, passing stuff that the American people want, versus a state like Florida where you have these extreme abortion bans, really hurting people's quality of life. And that contrast right there between the Joe Biden future and the MAGA future is exactly what he needs to be doing.
Just quickly, Brad, we have less than a minute left, but why spend time in Florida with that message? Why not spend time in the swing states that are ultimately going to decide whether or not you get to be president for a second term?
I wouldn't write off Florida so quickly. Look, there's a lot of discontent there with Ron DeSantis's leadership, with Trump's leadership. And yes, there are other states. There's North Carolina, there's Michigan. My organization is going to be focused on Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan in particular. And there is going to be a lot of Joe Biden in all of those states. I can guarantee it. So don't just think just because we're going to Florida, we're not going everywhere else.
All right, Pat Dennis, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. He, of course, is American Bridge 21st Century President, Democratic strategist, and Rick Davis, a Republican strategist and Bloomberg Politics contributor today, as we still, Joe, are keeping an eye on the Senate floor. And, of course, we'll update you when actual votes are cast and we're on our way through these procedures.
That's right. We're keeping the cots handy in case it's a really late night, Kaylee. Let's bring everyone up to date on what's happening elsewhere in the world and national news with Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. And as you were just discussing, senators are back on Capitol Hill to vote on that $95 billion in war aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Today's vote, of course, delayed. Senators are making speeches for and against the legislation. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
The Senate sits for a test on behalf of the entire nation. It's a test of American resolve, our readiness, and our willingness to lead.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Columbia University's main campus has switched to hybrid learning for the rest of the semester amid protests over Israel's war with Hamas. New York City Police Department Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters, Mike Gerber.
They informed us that they had students who were trespassing. They asked us to come onto campus to take action, and we did.
Demonstrations also took place at New York University, Yale, the University of Michigan, and on the West Coast, police reporting a large gathering on the Cal Poly Humboldt campus. The first witness in Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial in Manhattan, David Pecker, former publisher of the National Enquirer, explained how he would, quote, help the campaign at Trump's request to cover up several sex scandals during the 2016 campaign, and the judge has yet to rule on whether he believes Donald Trump violated a gag order. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Technology heavyweights rallying today, and that's helping lift the broader market right now. Every member of the so-called Magnificent Seven cohort of mega-cap technology stocks rising. Among them is Tesla. Right now, those shares are up 2.2% ahead of their earnings after the close of regular trading in New York today. NVIDIA, we'll call it the poster child of the AI boom. That's leading a surge today in the chip maker stocks. And United Parcel Service reporting profit that beat estimates. Also, news today, a top regulator is asking large Wall Street banks for non-disclosure agreements. This is in their swaps and clearing businesses. They're trying to see whether they muzzle would-be whistleblowers. The Commodities Futures Trading Commission has reached out to a number of banks, and they include J.P. Morgan Chase. Right now, the S&P 500, 60 points higher. That's up 1.2%. We're at 5,070 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 294 points. That's a rise of 0.8%. The NASDAQ Composite Index right now up 239 points. That's a rise of 1.6%. Auction of treasuries today. Let's take a quick look at the more policy-reactive 2-year yield. Down 4 basis points. That's at 492. The 10-year is 2 basis points lower. That's at 458 right now. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues with Joe and Kaylee.
John Tucker, thank you for keeping us honest on the markets. We're trying to keep you honest on Congress today. And you know that's a tough job. But we're watching voting get underway here in the Senate, a motion to table the foreign aid bill that would bring money to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, also includes the TikTok bill and some other matters, is likely to survive this. But we have to go through the motions. There are going to be a few procedural hurdles, including the actual cloture vote that will bring us to real voting up or down on the underlying bill. That's expected to happen late tonight, if today. We'll go through it together and let you know, of course, what happens here. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. This is the day, Kaylee. The president says he will sign it. And one of the biggest backers of this effort, and we've been in touch with them for months here, is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Remembering, there was a branding issue with this bill. We talk so much about foreign policy, geopolitics, and that's, of course, an enormous, that's the backdrop for this. But the spending is largely domestic, investing in our defense industrial base.
Yeah, when we talk about the 60-plus billions of dollars for Ukraine, a large chunk of that isn't actually being sent over to Ukraine in the form of cash in suitcases. It's being fed into our defense industrial base so that we can manufacture equipment largely to fill the stocks of what we already had sent over to Ukraine. And this could be a juicer of the U.S. economy in many ways for that reason. So it's on that note that we begin now with Neil Bradley. He is Executive Vice President over at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, also serves as their Chief Policy Officer. Neil, great to see you here in our Washington, D.C. studio. You, just days ago, before the House passed this legislation, penned a letter to them urging them to pass this because you say not only would it provide crucial funding and urgently needed military assistance to our allies, it would support a more robust domestic defense industrial base as well. How important is it that this legislation pass for U.S. business, for the U.S. economy?
Well, it's critical when you think about our defense industrial base. So there's one buyer largely, and that is the U.S. military. And when we begin to mothball weapons, when we begin to slow down those supply chain lines, it takes a long time to start back up. We know that we are in a world that is more dangerous than it's been in a long time. And so the ability to modernize our defense industrial base and those supply lines is critically important. And it's exactly what you just said. What we're doing is sending older weapons over to Ukraine, restarting our own domestic manufacturing facilities, in many cases expanding them, to refill our own stockpiles. It's kind of one of those win-win situations. Not only are we helping the Ukrainians in the fight against an aggressor, we're improving our stockpiles of our own weapons, and we're improving our domestic manufacturing capacity.
There's a momentum here, and you're referring to it. It takes a long time to get it started again, as you just said, once you wind it down. And there's been a big conversation about underinvestment when it comes to the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base. With that said, if we're firing up the engines again here, and in some cases expanding capacity, Raytheon has talked about the need to expand its manufacturing capacity. Where does that momentum bring us in the years ahead?
Well, it's a question of what do we need to sustain our own national security. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's driving it.
Does it sustain jobs?
It does sustain jobs, but listen, the driving impetus isn't to become a self-generative jobs machine. It really is our own national security. But we realize that when we make those investments, we want to maintain some base levels of capacity. And I think what experts have concluded is that we let that capacity, our ability to produce these things, get to a point where it made it harder to restart and ultimately was endangering our own security. So I suspect that as we get through this moment and period, we're going to figure out what's the right sustainable level that keeps supply chains operating, that keeps these facilities operating.
That prevents a shortage?
That prevents shortages and matches our needs. The other interesting thing that's going on here is, like in every other aspect of the economy, weapon systems are constantly advancing. And so, you know, if your stockpile consists of a model that's 10 years old, it is antiquated by today's standard. And the only way that you can keep up with the standards and the technology today is to be constantly innovating and manufacturing. So what we're building today is much better for our own national security, much more technologically sophisticated than the stockpiles that we're drawing down.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned technology specifically, because it's worth noting while the Chamber has advocated for this package for its national security merits, this is not just funding for allies. There's been a few other things attached, including the TikTok divest or ban bill, an expanded window. They now have a year potentially for that divestiture, but this is a specific private company being called out in legislation that is working its way through Congress and looks like it will get a signature from the president. Does the Chamber have any concerns about the precedent this may set moving forward if we are now in the business of targeting specific companies and telling them who can own them and who can't and who can control their algorithms?
Yeah, without getting into the specifics of TikTok's ownership.
Sure, just as an example.
As a larger question, there clearly is vulnerabilities with our own national security that we have to guard against, whether that's foreign investment coming in or intellectual property sharing abroad, and we have mechanisms for doing this. You know, in the 1980s, late 1980s, we created CFIUS, the Program Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, that is tasked with making sure that we're reviewing, in that case, investments into the United States on a national security grounds and protecting it from politicalization. So I think the important thing that we want to do is make sure that we're maintaining processes that keep the U.S. open for investment, that keep the U.S. engaged commercially with the world. But when national security comes into play, is making those decisions only on a national security basis, not based on political considerations.
So will the Chamber take a stand on a lawsuit here? We're told this is about to enter a protracted legal battle.
We have not opined on this particular transaction. We do opine along the strictures. When people propose changes to CFIUS or regulating investments abroad, we have to get the system right. And if we have the system right, then we can kind of resolve some of these questions that have emerged about kind of the political nature of the decision making.
Well, speaking of political decision-making, it's also worth pointing out that this TikTok bill, the supplemental funding, this has taken months to get across the finish line in Congress. After months prior of talking about it, it's taken us a long time to get to this moment. It's now mid-late April. We still have about 7 months to go, a little less, until the election. Can we expect anything else from this Congress in that intermittent time period? Is there anything else they're going to be able to get done, or it's all campaign from here?
Well, let's hope it's not all campaign. Listen, we're realists. We know it's an even-numbered year. It's a presidential election year. That is going to dominate a lot of the consideration. But if you think about this bill that the Senate's processing today, you're right. 6 months ago, this should have been done a long time ago. But it's been the principal issue that everyone's been waiting for the House to act on. The House acted on it over the weekend, and now we're wrapping it up for it to go to the president. The big priority that we see, unfinished business on Congress's to-do plate, is actually a tax extenders bill that passed the House of Representatives. Overwhelming bipartisan vote, something like 380 some votes. It's now sitting in the Senate. We're really looking for this May work period as a chance to get it done. Importantly, if it doesn't happen now, there's really no prospects for it to happen this year, or maybe for quite a while into next year, which means that we're going to keep in place tax increases that on a bipartisan basis, everyone agrees shouldn't have occurred, and these have real ramifications for business. For small businesses that make R&D spending, the median small business has seen about a 35% tax increase just as a result of moving from deducting R&D expenses to amortizing them over 5 years. I can't find anyone who thinks that's a good policy idea, so I have no idea why we're not getting Congress to fix that.
We're spending time on Balance of Power with Neil Bradley from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There's an important vote today. The FTC is going to vote on whether to ban non-compete agreements. Now, this is being framed as a pro-worker effort. What are you hearing from your members? What does it mean for employers?
Well, I think there are two issues. First is the policy around non-competes, and non-competes literally go back to the founding. People had non-compete agreements when they were apprentices in workshops. So this is not a new idea. It's always been regulated at the state level. States and courts have adopted different theories. The idea that we would ban all non-competes, which is what Lena Khan first proposed, is so radical that Governor Hochul in New York just vetoed a bill that would do that exact same thing. Now, we don't know what the final policy parameters are going to look like, but we think that there's actually an even more important issue at stake here. And that is the authority of the FTC. Under their 112-year-old statute, they judge anti-competitive behavior in their antitrust role on a case-by-case basis. They've never, and no one's ever believed they have the authority to write rules regulating competition in the marketplace. And the reason is that if they can write a rule under the guise of banning non-competes or limiting non-competes in this space, there's no aspect of the economy that they couldn't, under the guise of regulating competition, issue a regulation on. They put out a policy outline in 2022 where they talked about things like loyalty programs. Well, are loyalty programs anti-competitive because they lock you in as a consumer into rewarding a company over and over? Do we really think that three people at the FTC get to decide whether or not we have loyalty programs? They suggested things like in the M&A space, mergers and acquisitions that are currently legal under current law could by regulation become illegal. That's Congress's job, not the Federal Trade Commission's. And so we're quite worried about this power grab, that it's really opening a Pandora's box to regulate prices, to regulate commercial arrangements between parties, to really get into any aspect that they want to regulate.
So the chamber's going to take the FTC to court over this?
We will take the FTC to court over this if they proceed.
All right. On that note, we will leave it. Neil Bradley of the Chamber of Commerce, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. He, of course, is the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. Certainly, the Chamber keeping an eye not just on federal regulators, Joe, but, of course, Congress, as we're continuing to see that congressional work happening as we speak, still working through procedure right now on the Senate floor. Yeah, live view of the Senate floor. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, they're working through a motion to table at last check, Kaylee, this entire package that is expected to eventually pass. But we're waiting for a cloture vote. That's going to be the important one, remembering that a very similar, strikingly similar bill passed the Senate back in February with 70 yeses. We've got that number in our head, Kaylee, to see if that cloture vote comes right around the same mark. Obviously, these are the same individuals voting essentially on the same thing. Yes, with just a few things added, like we talked about with Neil, including the TikTok divestor ban bill, as well as repo, the idea that seized, frozen Russian assets that are housed in the U.S. could be used to fund Ukraine's war effort, and Iranian sanctions are in play here as well. So there are a few extra things in this, but because there are so many parts of it that many senators would like to see advance, whether it's aid for Israel or Ukraine, if you're in favor of any one of those issues, and it's all packaged together, a vote for one is a vote for all, and a vote for all is a vote for one. Which was the design here, right? And Mike Johnson managed to get all of these passed, although it appears that if they had been brought to the floor together, they probably would still have passed. All of these
separate bills got 300 votes or more, bipartisan, which is considered pretty good in this day and age here in Washington, D.C. So obviously, we're going to keep tabs on this for you. It's going to happen late tonight, the real vote, not the cloture vote, if not tomorrow at one point if things start to slip a little bit. And we're going to let Carol and Tim keep tabs on this for you in the meantime, because it's almost time for Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master, Tim Stenevec with us right now from World Headquarters in New York. How's it going, guys? What do you have coming up today?
Joe and Kaylee, why does it always have to be so complicated when Congress is trying to pass a measure? Like, why? Why can't it be just yay or nay? Let's go. Let's put it into fact.
Well, it will be eventually, just real late tonight.
Okay.
We have to go through all the motions, Carol, so everyone gets to have their say. You know that.
Oh, it's politics as usual, I guess, Tim.
Yeah, but something a little unusual is that we're going to have Joe Matthew join us
Yes.
just a little bit later on our program to help break down what exactly is going on. Also, guys, we're following Tesla because the company reporting earnings, and the stock is in, quote, no man's land, down more than 40% so far this year.
Brutal. Well, we'll look for coverage of that after the bell. And of course, we'll look forward to all of the coverage that Tim Stenevec and Carol Master have coming up on Bloomberg Business Week, including keeping an eye with Joe on the Senate floor. Remember, we're talking procedure here. This is not a final passage vote that is upon us yet.
That's right.
We got to get through a few things first, but it is not a question of if this will pass. It's just a question right now of when, Joe.
In the throes of earnings reporting season, we're going to have a lot to talk about later. Not just earnings, but we'll do this again on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 o'clock. We'll have a much better sense, I think, then of the timeline. Kaylee, I'll meet you then.
Sounds good. This is Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. Carol Master along with Tim Stenevec live here on Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get to the setup on this Tuesday, April 23rd. And we've got Tim again, a rally again in those mega cap tech names.
Yeah, as we get ready for earnings from the Magnificent Seven. Well, not all of them today, but they have seen gains in today's session.
Yeah.
One in particular, Tesla, in the earnings spotlight. It reports after the bell today against a level of corporate chaos, and the stock is in no man's land.
Always a lot going on when it comes to Elon and Tesla. Also, Russia already threatening to step up strikes on Ukraine in response to U.S. lawmakers voting to provide new military aid to Kiev. It's part of a much bigger aid package, military and foreign aid, if you will. It's something that we know Joe and Kayla were just tracking, so we're going to get the latest on all of that.
Plus, Lockheed Martin's first quarter beat thanks to delivering more fighter jets and missile systems. The CEO weighing in.
And one more thing, drone racing. It's a thing, folks, and apparently investors are noticing. It's one of the latest sports plays. John Tucker is waiting patiently to talk about his drone racing that he's been doing. Let's toss things over to
Yeah,
John.
they do it in vacant malls.
So you know this?
Oh yeah, no, it's
That's
like
what you do on your weekends?
It's a YouTube channel. Let's start with the the cohort we know as the Magnificent Seven, as you guys were talking about. Tesla, after the close of regular trading, ahead of that, up over 2%. The earnings report, not really expected to be anything to write home about. All 7 of those Mag 7 stocks up ahead of the earnings reports that start today. Keep in mind, Tesla shares, they've been battered up to this point. I know you're going to take a deeper dive into that coming up. Their earnings we've already received include the conglomerate Danaher, helping power the S&P 500. Its shares up over 7%. Globe Life also doing some of the heavy lifting today. That stock 12% higher. The insurance company raising its operating earnings per share forecast for the full year. Right now, the S&P 500 64 points higher. That's up 1.3%. 5,075 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 288 points. That's up 0.75%. The Nasdaq Composite Index 267 points higher. That's up 1.25%. Oh, and we had an auction today of Treasury debt, so we'll get into that at some point. 2-year yields right now, 4 basis points lower at 4.92. It's exciting. 10-year yield right now, 2 basis points lower.
We talked about it yesterday.
4.58.
Sure you were listening.
You previewed it.
Yeah.
Okay.
See,
anyway.
You were noticing.
We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Carol and Tim.
Thank you so much, John Tucker. He mentioned Globe Life. That's the #1 gainer in the S&P 500.
Is it one of your gainers for later?
Yeah.
If we get to gainers with Tesla earnings?
We're going to be consumed with Tesla, no doubt about it. Well, Globe Life is definitely an outperformer today, but go figure, Tesla, which we've seen a downward move for over a week or so. It's actually up to about 2.3%, reporting earnings after the closing bell. The backdrop, you know what it is, everybody. We've talked about price cuts. We've talked about job cuts, senior execs leaving, an all-in commitment to full self-driving. And then there's Elon, well known for the unexpected when it comes to strategy and really anything.
Tesla shares are weathering the longest rout since late 2022, tumbling nearly 19% just over the past 7 days. That's before today's gains, amid the doubts about its business strategy as sales of EVs slump. With more, here is a Bloomberg News equity markets reporter, Esha Day, here in our studio. Esha, Tesla shares down about over 40%, not including today's gains, so far this year. You write in your piece that their shares are in, quote, no man's land. What does that mean?
Well, as you said, like shares were down 43%, and I think last I checked, they were like the worst performers this year on the S&P 500.
Yeah.
So when we look at like technical strategists, when they are looking at this stock and kind of trying to make sense of what's lying ahead, they're seeing very little support from technical charts. Charts are showing that from here on, the stock is already below, and despite today's gains, the stock is already below the $150 mark, which was like a really key mark for this stock. And the risk is that if Elon Musk and team does not really give us anything really solid to back on, or even gives us like a vague kind of outlook for the rest of the year and what the strategy is going to be, any kind of decline in this stock could start snowballing. And in that case, we may even see the stock fall as low as close to the $100 mark, which would be a huge decline from here on. But at the same time, it won't be something that we haven't seen before, right? This is something we saw in 2022 and very early 2023. That was the level around which the stock was trading. And there are potential risks that we might see a drop near those levels at some point.
You know, it's interesting. You take a look at it, right? It's well below its 200-day, its 30-day, its 90-day. You know, pick your day, and it's below it. We know the move that it's gone lower. Having said that, you look at something like RSI, Relative Strength Index, and yeah, the numbers are saying it's oversold, but it's only oversold if indeed the upbeat expectations we've had about Tesla and its growth trajectory hold. And I think that's part of it, right? And this is something we're going to get into. I mean, everybody has been kind of banking on this cheaper Tesla vehicle, which would really drive momentum in sales, and yet it doesn't seem like Elon's committed to that.
Yeah, that's really the biggest challenge this time, right? Like, if every way you look at the stock or look at the fundamentals, like, you know, look at earnings expectations. Earnings expectations are down like 50% over the past 12 months. Revenue expectations down more than 20%. Free cash flow down more than 70%. So, you know, fundamentals are just not supporting the stock at this point, right? So, you know, yes, there is a possibility that the stock is oversold and may see some sort of a near-term bounce, something that we are seeing today. But is there real support from the fundamentals? That is something we will only know after the market today. But again, let's remember, fundamentals are not the only thing that people are looking at today. What we are looking at is the strategy pivot. And if Elon Musk comes out and says that, you know, we are going to ditch the $25,000 car that was supposed to be like the growth driver for this stock for the longest time, that is not going to be a good news for this stock, and nobody really knows, and that's where the air pocket really comes in.
You have somebody in the story, I think it was Dan Levy over at Barclays, an investment thesis pivot, right? And that's what's got everybody so disturbed, Tim, is just how he's thinking about the business going forward.
Yeah, and look, I mean, this is a guy who has weathered many storms before in the past, and this idea of such a drawdown in Tesla stock, it's not completely new to the company. Certainly new to the company being in the S&P 500 over the last few years, but not new to the company. I mean, this is a company people talked about potentially going bankrupt a few years ago in the wake of everything that happened with the Model 3, and I think it's fair to say that it certainly recovered from that. Is this time different?
It is different, but again, you know, a lot of people that I speak to, big Tesla investors, they also do bring up this point that, you know, this is not the first time that Elon Musk is facing a big challenge. Indeed, but again, you know, the past is not a guarantee of the future, right? You know, just because he, you know, this stock or this company kind of weathered those storms, there is no guarantee that this time it would succeed. Again, you know, people are known to bank on Elon Musk and his abilities and for good reason. So we'll see.
What do we hear over and over again? He lands rockets on ships.
Well, I know, and like EVs, the conversation, the narrative, and the action actually changed dramatically because of Elon Musk. So I agree that I think all of us, even as we are skeptical sometimes, we're like, never rule Elon and what he does out. Esha, but interesting to see what's going on with the stock. Keep in mind, back in November of 2021, it was a $409 stock. So we've definitely seen some move to the downside. Esha Day, equity markets reporter at Bloomberg News, joining us here in studio as we get ready for Tesla earnings after the closing bell.
Hey, also on our mind right now, what's happening on Capitol Hill? And that's where we go now to Bloomberg Balance of Power co-host Joe Matthew, who joins us from our D.C. bureau for the latest on the sweeping foreign aid package making its way through the Capitol. Joe, Carol and I were listening earlier. We were watching. We heard you and Kayleigh Lyons talking about how it could be a long night, how it's no longer a question of if, but when this long-awaited foreign aid package heads to President Biden's desk to become law. But where are we right now in the process?
We're going through some procedural votes right now in the Senate. Tim, what they're trying to do is essentially give everyone a chance to speak. There are some who are concerned on both sides of the aisle about the way these bills were written. Bernie Sanders wants to talk about funding for Israel that he opposes in some cases, wants to qualify the way that funding is provided. Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, is talking about Ukraine here, and they're both going to have an opportunity to say their pieces. This comes down to essentially a timing deal. What they do is agree on how much time will be devoted to debate. Then there'll be a cloture vote, as you keep hearing people refer to that. That would essentially shut debate down and pave the way for a real vote on those bills tonight. Guys, we see days like this a lot in the Senate. They want to get home for a recess that they've been kept from starting here. They'll bring in the takeout later, probably a couple cases of wine, and then they'll bring out the cots. That'll be the threat. We're going to spend the night here, and that will probably take place in the wee hours of the morning. So by the time we're together tomorrow, it'll be done.
Do they actually Do they actually trot out the sleeping bags and the cots and the popcorn?
That's not fake. They actually do have. There's a storage room full of cots when they need that stuff. And yes, staffers are frequently sent out to get Mexican food, and you'll see them coming in with the big cases of wine. That's when you know it's going to be a late night. In this case, most of the work is happening today.
Yeah.
Once they clear through all of this stuff this afternoon, we'll have a better sense of the timing.
What I am kind of blown away by is the process getting up to here, and Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, conservative Republican. I know the Democrats have helped dramatically in this process, but he went down to Mar-a-Lago, talked with Donald Trump. I'm trying to understand his role as a power broker, or maybe I'm using the wrong words. How do you see it? What's his role there now as kind of leading this process and actually getting something done, a major package?
Well, that's right. You're asking the right questions, and that was an important trip to Mar-a-Lago. The fact of the matter is Mike Johnson actually has a threat to fire him, a motion to vacate, the same exact thing we saw happen to Kevin McCarthy, and it's been filed by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and 2 other Republicans have signed on, but it's not privileged. This is just a threat right now, and she's raising money on it. The fact is, Marjorie Taylor Greene is very close to Donald Trump and wants to be in his good graces, and Donald Trump has had some very nice things to say about Mike Johnson because he does not want the distraction of a leadership battle, another speaker fight in the middle of his campaign for president here. So he's decided to make Mike Johnson his guy. And that's the best bodyguard you can get in the schoolyard that we call the House of Representatives. And to your point, Carol, he's also got Democrats backing him up. So even if they did trigger this motion to vacate, it is expected that Democrats would be there to help save him because nobody wants to live through this all over again. Might be difficult in the next Congress if Republicans keep their 1-seat majority for him to be elected speaker again. But it's amazing the transformation that we have seen. And at the moment, he appears to be safe.
Does it mean, Joe, and I'm even afraid to ask this question, that we could see more cooperation between Democrats and Republicans in the House ahead of the election?
I love that question.
Maybe a border bill?
I love that question. Well, a border bill, boy, to see that happen between now and November would take a miracle in Washington. But people are calling this a coalition government all of a sudden because of what we just saw happen. We can start talking about this with English accents if you want, but the fact of the matter is what took place this week would be kind of normal in any other period of time. It's called bipartisanship. The part that was weird for people is that you've got the Rules Committee with Democrats and Republicans who do not agree, and the fact that Republicans wouldn't go along with their own speaker on this, on the Rules Committee, does show how much division there is inside that Republican conference. And guys, that part's not about to change.
Is there something, though, in at least the House measure and as it works its way through for almost everyone, a little bit of something for everyone?
In a broad sense, yes. You can call this a win for Joe Biden, and you can call this a win for Mike Johnson, and you can call this a win for Chuck Schumer. I think that that's fair all the way around. But I would just remind everybody, this is the same bill with a couple of different dollars and TikTok, I'll give you that passed the Senate back in February. We just waited 6 months for this to take place with soldiers in Ukraine who don't have a shell to fire. And those are probably the real winners here today.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost $61 billion for Ukraine, more than $26 billion for Israel, and humanitarian aid, about $8.1 billion for Indo-Pacific allies, and then of course there's the TikTok sanctions. When you look over it, what does that kind of tell us about what's top of mind for lawmakers and what they do want to indeed get done in terms of a major, broader policy message?
Well, the message here is going to be a domestic one. You know, we got into some very deep debates about what our role should be in Ukraine and then separately in Israel. But the fact of the matter is the bulk of that money that you just walked through here is going to be spent here in the U.S. by investing in our defense industrial base. This is Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin, just up with earnings today. And those are the companies that have to replenish the stocks that we've been burning through here. And we haven't had a great investment in our domestic industrial defense manufacturing base here, to the point where the underinvestment has left us short in some areas. And so you're going to see a major domestic investment here into those companies, and it will benefit the efforts in Ukraine and Israel by extension. But I think some lawmakers regret the way this was pitched, because most of that money is going to be spent here at home.
Joe, to that point, was there a pivotal moment here that got Republicans on board with this? Was it lumping together Israel and Ukraine? Was it something else? Was it the conflict between Israel and Iran that pushed this forward relatively quickly?
Iran's attack against Israel certainly got this moving again. This has been 6 months in the making. Of course, we go back to last year and talk about the debate. That's really what got the gears turning following Mike Johnson's visit to Mar-a-Lago. This has all really happened in the last week or two. But I'll turn around your question a little bit. It was, in fact, stripping Ukraine from Israel that allowed the House to get this done, because there were progressives who didn't like the Israel funding, there were Republicans who didn't like the Ukraine funding, and everyone had a chance to vote the way they wanted. Then they put them all together for this vote that we're about to see happen tonight.
All right, so just remind us of kind of, for those of us, all of us who will be listening and watching, Joe, kind of how the next couple of hours, how you think they could possibly play out. What kind of, signpost do we have to kind of keep an eye on?
Watch for the cloture vote. It sounds wonky, but that is essentially the test vote here that would kill a filibuster if they actually still did that in the Senate. Look for the vote number on that. They need 60 to clear that threshold to get to the real vote, remembering that there were 70 yeses in the Senate when they voted on this thing back in February. So I'll be curious to see if they hit 70 again. Some concerns about TikTok might change that number. But if they can clear the procedural or the cloture vote, then this is basically a done deal tonight, and you don't have to stay up all night watching.
But do you have your wine, your cot, your Mexican food yet,
What
Joe?
is your drink of choice when you're waiting for these?
Yes. It would be wine, I have to admit, unless, of course, they call and they say, Joe, we want you to talk about it on Bloomberg. And then I, of course, drink ice water. But, of course, these lawmakers have ice water in their veins, so they can do this.
That's a good place to end.
Be up late.
Love it.
All right, good stuff as always. So appreciated. Our own Joe Matthew, co-host, as you know, of Bloomberg Balance of Power here on radio and television. Catch him, though. He'll be back at 6 p.m. Wall Street time and following the vote for us. So appreciate it. Oh, 5 p.m. Forgive me. Yeah, 5 p.m.
Yeah, 5 p.m.
I only tease it at the end of the show.
Yeah.
5 p.m. So we'll know. But we might know something beforehand, but it sounds like it's going to go into the wee hours.
Well, we do know that there's a rally underway. The S&P 500 higher by 1.3%, the NASDAQ Composite higher by 1.7%, the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher right now by 0.7%.
Yeah, waiting some big earnings. We also have yields kind of backing off a little bit. 458 on that 10-year note, folks. We had some auctions. We also had some economic news. A little bit of a mixed bag there. 2-year note right now just below 5% at 4.92. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Still to come, that foreign aid, what it will mean for Ukraine. A policy insider joins us. That's next.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. A live shot of the floor of the Senate, the cloture vote underway, as we just talked with our Joe Matthew of Balance of Power, one of the co-hosts there, saying that they need 60 votes to clear the threshold to get to the real vote. Basically, the cloture vote, if they get the votes, would essentially shut down the debate that's been going underway on the floor of the Senate. So that would be a key move, Tim, in this process.
We'll keep our eye on it and bring you any updates as they happen from Capitol Hill. In the meantime, let's stay in Washington, D.C. for a check on the latest world and national news with Amy Morris. Amy. Oh, excuse me. I want to talk, actually, stay on Capitol Hill and talk a little bit about what's going on with the vote.
Yeah, there's a lot going on today, right? And as we try to keep you certainly up to date on what's going on in D.C., and it all has to do with the $95 billion in emergency supplemental funding that would be provided, as we've been talking about, for Ukraine, Israel, and also the Indo-Pacific region under that measure working its way right now on the Senate floor. The measure would also require TikTok's Chinese owner to divest the video sharing app, impose sanctions on Iran, and seize Russian assets. So there's a lot of pieces, but the big one really has to do with military aid, in particular, almost $61 billion for Ukraine, Tim.
Well, let's get to the interview. Angela Stent is a Russia and foreign policy expert. She's senior fellow at Brookings Institution, also a former national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and who also served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. She's the author of the 2019 book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She's also Professor Emerita of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown. She joins us from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and she's been a go-to throughout the Ukraine-Russian war. So, Angela, good to have you here with us. Ukraine President Zelensky telling NBC's Meet the Press over the weekend that this U.S. support, quote, will really strengthen the armed forces of Ukraine, and that now we would have all the chance to stabilize the situation. From your perspective, how important is this U.S. measure from a financial perspective, military perspective, and also from a show of support perspective?
So I think it's crucially important on all of those counts. This vote has been 6 months in the making, and in those 6 months, the Russians have made gains, particularly in the last few months. And the Ukrainians have literally been running out of ammunition and also air defenses. So what they really need is the artillery, and they need the air defenses. And frankly, if this vote had not taken place, and if Ukraine doesn't get the assistance, then I think their prospects would look pretty dim by the end of the year. If this all goes through, they have a fighting chance, if you like, to continue pushing back against the Russians and to do better in this war than they have been doing for the past 6 months.
A fighting chance, but what would you say to critics who say that even with this funding, you're just delaying the inevitable of a Russian win here?
I don't think it's inevitable. Our European allies have also been stepping up and supplying more weapons, and they're financially doing more for Ukraine than we are. European Union with a 50 billion euro financial instrument just a few months ago, money that they've given to Ukraine. So it's not inevitable. If one believes that at some point there will be a negotiation and there'll have to be some kind of a settlement over territory, the Ukrainians can still make gains with our assistance. And don't forget, we should never forget, 80% of this money will go to U.S. businesses and U.S. jobs for people manufacturing those weapons.
Right. We just talked with our Joe Matthew about replenishing the U.S. defense stockpiles that have certainly been coming down as a result of this support. How is Ukraine doing in this fight? I feel like we've talked to you so many times about kind of where we are. Do we see an ending this year? Do we see an ending anytime soon? I don't know. How do you see it at this point?
Well, so as I said, it's been Ukraine has suffered some reversals in the past few months. The Russians have taken a bit more territory. The Ukrainians really have a manpower shortage now. So a major challenge for Zelensky is to mobilize more young men. They've lowered the draft age now from 27 to 25. Certainly they can go on fighting this year and into next year. What happens after that really is anyone's guess. It depends also whether there's going to be more U.S. assistance next year, which we don't know about. But the Russians seem to be doing pretty well now, and their economy is on a war footing. exporting, and they're just manufacturing weapons at a very high rate. And of course, they're getting drones from Iran, and they're getting ammunition from North Korea. And the Russians do have more men that they can put in this fight than the Ukrainians do.
On the U.S. front, what did you make of the change in position of House leadership, Professor? The idea that, that the Speaker was against it until he wasn't.
Right. I think Speaker Johnson listened to a lot of people. We know that he got briefings from the CIA Director, William Burns, about just what the situation was actually like and how dire it was for the Ukrainians. He talked to a number of top Republicans, as we know, in the Senate, starting with Mitch McConnell there, and the people who were very much in favor of this assistance. He talked to Ukrainian evangelicals who managed to tell him that what Marjorie Taylor Greene had said about Christians being persecuted in Ukraine is just not true. They gave them. So he talked to a wide variety of other people. And in the end, I think the most important thing maybe was going to Mar-a-Lago and meeting with former President Trump, who himself understood that he didn't really want there to be a Russian victory, particularly if he were then in the White House. And therefore, despite his earlier opposition, President Trump, he was in favor of it, as long as some of it is a loan. And some of this money, I think $9 billion of it, is a loan, but I should say it's a forgivable loan.
Exactly, exactly. How are you thinking about Vladimir Putin at this point and how he could possibly end this war? Does he have to save face? And what his ambitions still are when it comes to his country and its ambitions?
Yeah, well, the Kremlin is furious about the vote in the House, and they're furious about this assistance. We know that there was an emergency meeting in the Kremlin very late at night after the House passed the bill. I don't think that Putin's ambitions in Ukraine have changed. He still wants Russia to dominate Ukraine, and he still wants there to be regime change in Kyiv. He may understand now that it's going to be much more difficult to do, and he can always tell his people that Russia has been victorious. He could settle for something less than the maximum demands, but that would involve territory that Russia has already taken since February of 2022. He might not be willing to give any of that up. So I think until this House vote was passed, the Russians thought that they were really in the home stretch of winning this war. I think now they have to reevaluate that.
But I mean, in terms of ambitions beyond Ukraine, do you still think that Russian President Vladimir Putin, Angela, might have some ambitions beyond that?
Oh, he no doubt does. I mean, I think the next country would be Moldova, which has a rather fragile political system and where we know that the Russians definitely have ambitions. The Baltic states and Poland are obviously very concerned. I don't think it would be possible for Russia to do another major invasion of a different country anytime soon. But it can also chip away, particularly through the use of disinformation, or in the case of Moldova, by supporting and funding pro-Russian parties that will undermine the political system there. But certainly, as long as he's in the Kremlin, I don't think he's going to give up any of these ambitions.
So, we have been speaking to you, Dr. Stent, many times over the last 2+ years about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Given where we are today, what is your realistic view on how it could end? You did say that Putin might not go as far as regime change and actually taking over the entire country, but what's a realistic way for our audience to understand how we could see an end here?
Well, there would be an end to it if both sides, first of all, agree that it's time to negotiate, and neither side agrees on that at the moment. And if the Ukrainian side is willing to accept a territorial settlement that falls short of their maximum goals, which of course is taking back all territory that Russia has occupied since 2014. And if the Russians were willing, if the Kremlin were willing to accept a settlement that, again, falls short of their maximum goals, which is taking over all of Ukraine. But I think what we would see would be much more a ceasefire. And then it might be a Korean situation where you actually don't have a treaty between the two sides, but you have a de facto ceasefire, but then you would have to have troops ensuring that the ceasefire isn't broken. And I think the Ukrainians would have to get pretty strong security guarantees from all of the major Western countries to bolster them, to arm them, to try and deter any future Russian invasion.
How do you think about what happens here in the U.S. presidential election? And I do want to remind everybody, we are watching and monitoring the cloture vote on the floor of the Senate, and it does look like right now we're at 59 votes in favor of the measure, and there are 60 votes, as we talked about with our Joe Matthew, that are needed to limit the debate. And this would be a major move in terms of passage of this measure as it's making its way, and then move it on to potentially a final vote there. So just a reminder, we're at 59 votes, 60 are needed to take this to the next step. So we'll continue monitoring it and let you know as soon as it crosses. Having said that, back to Angela Stent that we were talking to, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Angela, how do you think about what happens in the U.S. election, who is ultimately in the White House, and what that means potentially if this war is still going on, what it might mean?
Well, so I think if President Biden is reelected, there will be continued support for Ukraine. Will the U.S. be willing to do more? Will it be willing to supply Ukraine with a range of weapons that will actually reach deep into Russian territory? That's a question. If President Trump wins the election, I think there would be a diminution of support for Ukraine. President Trump has said that he could end the war in 24 hours. Although
Angela, hang on for a second. We just do want to break in the procedural vote that has been going on in the Senate on Ukraine-Israel aid. It does have enough votes to advance this measure, this aid, which also includes a provision for TikTok. So it looks like we do have the votes here, and then it will move on. But as we heard from our Joe Matthew earlier, this basically essentially shuts down future debate on this, and then it can move on to a vote.
Okay, well, it's all politics, and I want to let Dr. Stent finish your question, Carol, which was about politics and what happens in the November election, depending on who the winner is. Please, Dr. Stent, continue.
Yeah, so I will just continue with what I was saying about if President Trump wins the election. He said that he would end the war quickly. We'll see whether that happens. But I think even if he were instrumental in ending the war, I presume that a Trump administration would want to have a settlement in which Ukraine isn't completely defeated and Russia can say that it won. I'm not sure that that would be in their interest or in the interest of the United States. I'm not sure how they would do that, but I think that would ultimately determine what they do.
That's my question, Dr. Stent. Short of actually using American force, how does the U.S. end a war?
Well, if the Trump administration were to say to Ukraine, okay, we're cutting off all funding, and if the Europeans began to cut off their funding, then of course it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to continue fighting, although they would fight as long as they could with whatever they had. So that's one scenario, which would be to force them to the negotiating table, but that would take some time too.
Hey, just to recap, everybody, we are, of course, talking with Angela Stent, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. But again, just moments ago, the U.S. Senate has enough votes to advance the $95 billion aid package, providing funding to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The vote to limit debate and move to final passage as soon as today is, though, ongoing. And as we've mentioned, also, there were 4 pieces, if you will, to this measure. The package includes a measure that would force ByteDance to divest its ownership of TikTok or face a ban here in the United States. But again, as we talked about with Joe Matthew earlier, this is very key in kind of basically putting an end to a lot of the debate that was happening on the floor and moving it along.
So it raises the question for you, Dr. Stent, about if you think that this bill, potential bill, this measure, goes far enough.
I think it goes far enough so far, yes. I mean, if we're going to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles, which we are. I do know that we already have some weapons over the border in Poland. President Biden told President Zelensky on Monday that some of those weapons can get to Ukraine very quickly, as long as he gets the legislation on his desk to sign it. But I think hopefully it's not the last assistance package that there will be for Ukraine.
All right, going to leave it there. As always, keeping us up to date on this and really giving us some perspective. Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Her book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, former policy and intelligence official, joining us there from the nation's capital.
Well, let's stay in the nation's capital and bring in Bloomberg Balance of Power co-host Joe Matthew from our D.C. bureau. Just to recap, the Senate does have enough votes to advance a $95 billion package providing funding to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Joe, so explain what happens now that the Senate does have enough votes to advance the bill.
But this is a big move, right? Correct? In moving it along?
Yeah, look, in the days now where you don't see actual filibusters on the floor of the Senate, there's no Jimmy Stewart to sit there talking you off a cliff. This is kind of the equivalent. Instead of letting people run out of breath, you have to clear this hurdle. So you get 60, you're good to go. They could have this vote and will do it at some point, likely later today. The question, though, is what's the final vote going to look like? Remembering that 70 senators voted yes the last time we went through this when they voted this initial package back in February that we were told was DOA in the House. This is basically the same legislation. Add the TikTok component, the Repo Act, and a couple of other things. It's basically the same thing. The dollar figure is awfully close. So we're curious if it hits 70 or maybe tops that level here, and that could mirror the final vote. To your point, Carol, this is significant because we're basically taking the temperature of all the senators here as to how they feel about what will be a final vote later on today. So that's likely to happen tonight. Things are starting to move a little bit more quickly today in the Senate now that we've gotten to this point.
So what takes so long tonight? Why are they bringing in the cots?
Well,
go ahead, Carol.
I just want to mention, I'm just looking at a live feed of C-SPAN, and it looks like there are 72 yays, if you will, Joe.
That's right.
There you have it.
Yep.
And that's
72 yes, 13 no's, and that is significant to think, Carol, that this got more support with TikTok added to it. That TikTok bill, the standalone bill that passed the House, that was very similar to the language here, divest or ban, it was a shorter timeline. It only allowed 6 months to divest the company. That was not likely to pass the Senate. A lot of members had trouble with the timeline. They had trouble with the First Amendment component here. And now look at this, 74 now as we look at the count in real time. Apparently not too bothered with TikTok when it's combined with Ukraine and Israel and with that longer time horizon. But listen, we've talked about this here on Business Week. There's going to be a pronounced legal challenge that follows this. ByteDance is ready to spend money on it, and we'll see how this goes in the near term. It likely will not be decided between now and the election based on what we're hearing.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, right, that it's going to be pushed off, and no surprise, there's a lot going on here. You know, how are you thinking, Joe? You know, we ask you this a lot. You understand these cycles that go on in Washington, the politics of everything, but, you know, this ability to actually get something done, some significant. We just talked to Angela Stent, who you know well, too. Yeah. Insider, understands Russia, understands Putin, understands the significance of helping out Ukraine, many would argue, and the U.S. being there for its broader European allies, but the significance of this and actually it getting done. Well, we're not there yet completely.
Well, considering that's true, but on track to, I think it's like, you know, we were saying earlier, it's just a question of when, you know, and in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, it was really interesting listening to Angela Stent because a lot of people believe that this is it. This will be the final aid package that could be approved for Ukraine. So how is that money best used? It may not be in the form of another counteroffensive. The conversation that we're hearing in Washington in a more pronounced manner is, can we use this money? How do we use this money to better strengthen Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table? We're not near peace talks. We're not near a truce of some sort with Ukraine and Russia. But when you have $60 billion in the time horizon that we know we have here with the next 6 months to a year, it's going to be interesting to listen to how that conversation moves because there is fatigue here. While these bills are passing, it would be very difficult in an election year to get another multi-billion-dollar tranche through this Congress. It's just not likely to happen when it comes to Ukraine.
Joe, now at 74 yes and 16 no.
Yep, that's right. 74-16, and there we have it. $95.3 billion in total we talk about Ukraine and Israel, but there's also Taiwan here and an Indo-Pac component with an eye on China. The idea was this was a national security request, and at one time in the Senate, it was also coupled with a border compromise to secure our border here and more carefully define the amnesty laws in this country. But of course, that fell apart, and now we're left with funding for these three, and then the sidecar bill, as they call it, with TikTok, Iran sanctions, and the Repo Act that we haven't talked about quite enough here. That would actually use money from seized Russian assets to help pay off this money for Ukraine. That's partly how Mike Johnson got this past a lot of Republicans who wanted to see this as a loan, not a gift.
Hey, Joe, when you talk about the timeline here, considering the amount of money that Ukraine could be getting if this bill actually does become law, what's the runway that it gives the country?
Well, in terms of Ukraine, it's really difficult to tell. You know, they've been out of ammo in some cases for weeks. We've heard units who've been without a shell to fire for the better part of a month, and morale has been terrible. So this is going to be about rebuilding here and reassessing the strategy. It really, like I mentioned, might not be in the form of a counteroffensive, as Ukraine needs to pick its battles here carefully. The problem is that this money can bring a lot of shells, it can bring ammunition and material that Ukraine needs, but it cannot bring troops. And Ukraine right now is facing a major shortage of manpower. They're talking about different ways to conscript people, how long they should be in the battlefield, but these are exhausted members of the army, and the reinforcements are not there in the way that Ukraine needs. That's not something that we can buy, and that is something that President Zelensky is going to have to factor into his decisions when it comes to strategy and how to use this money.
All right, so appreciate it. Joe, thank you so much leading us into it and out of this key vote. And right now we're at 75 yeses, 17 noes. But again, as we said, passing that cloture vote and moving on. Joe Matthew, thank you so much. Co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power. He's going to be back at 5 p.m. Wall Street time, and we'll continue that coverage.
Hey, we're still seeing some buying in the equity trade. Just over an hour until the markets close. Let's get an update on the way stocks are moving in business news. Here's John Tucker.
And of course, Tesla is going to kick off earnings for the Magnificent Seven. That happens after the close of regular trading today. Tesla expected to report first quarterly sales drop since the first quarterly sales drop since the pandemic struck. Also seen posting the steepest EPS decline year over year in the Magnificent Seven. This according to estimates that are compiled by Bloomberg Intelligence. So ahead of that, the stocks all pushing higher. All the major averages are up. You have 10 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 in the green right now. NVIDIA shares leading the semiconductor stocks. And we also had some economic reports today. Business activity expanding in April at the slowest pace this year on a pullback in demand. So that kind of helps the view at this point that the Fed is going to have to raise rates, cut rates this year. Right now, the two-year yield, 5 basis points lower. That is at 492. Overall, the S&P 500, 64 points higher. That's up 1.3%. We're at 5,075 in the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 287 points. That's up 0.75%. And right now, the Nasdaq Composite Index, 277 points higher. That is up 1.8%. We check the markets for you.
You do.
All day long.
So appreciate it.
Right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. Back to Carol and Tim.
All right, John, thank you so much. Well, shares of Lockheed Martin, we've been watching them. They, at their highs, rallying 2.6%, settling back a bit. Now, little change, slightly lower. Company out with earnings, Tim.
Yeah, first quarter operating income beat expectations thanks to delivering more fighter jets and missile systems. All 4 business units at Lockheed Martin increased sales in the quarter, boosting overall revenue by 14%. We've got with us Bloomberg Television's co-host of The Close, Romain Bostic, who caught up with the company's CFO a little earlier. He joins us here in our studio with more. Romain, before we get to your conversation, just tie in everything we were talking about just now with Joe Matthew, with Angela Stent, with what is happening in Washington, D.C., with what's going on with Lockheed.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I mean, I did have a chance to sit down with Jay Malavi as well as the COO of Frank St. John. Now, of course, what happened in the most recent quarter doesn't actually encapsulate what's transpired over the last couple of days. The bill that you were just talking about in the Senate, that's about $95 billion, and a good chunk of that is going to flow to Lockheed. A lot of that is for missile interceptors and other defense programs that are going to go to Israel, to Ukraine, and of course to Taiwan as well. In addition to that, just last week, Lockheed won a contract, a $17 billion contract for another missile system here. That's a longer-term contract. Now, those aren't reflected in the most recent numbers But looking forward into the rest of the year and beyond, they are going to have to update their forecasts.
Well, and so let's talk about that, because didn't we get some guidance a few months ago from the company? So it looks like things are actually even improving here.
Yeah, they gave some guidance 3 months ago when they last reported, and if you've looked at the stock actually has been down. It fell quite a bit, as a lot of people didn't think they were going to achieve that. When I spoke with Jay Malavi, he said very specifically that they stand by that forecast here, looking roughly at about almost $70 billion in revenue and roughly about 26 to 27 bucks a share on an EPS basis. They're basically saying not only can they meet that, but they say they're willing to revisit that forecast at some point in Q2, though they would not commit to anything.
It's interesting to see, though, the stock moves, because it did rally today, but it's really kind of run out of steam. So it feels like, I don't know, investors waiting and
Yeah, and this is one of those stocks. It's not a volatile stock. I mean, it was up 3%. At one point, that was the biggest intraday gain going back to October. Last time I checked, the stock had basically flatlined here on the day. But they were really quick to point out, too. I mean, when they defend their business, they talk about this idea how so much of their revenue really is dispersed. It is spread out over multiple years. That's a plus. If you're getting a dividend or you're getting a buyback, that's a plus. But of course, in the short term, you're not going to get those types of volatile swings that you would see in, say, like a Tesla.
When we talk about defense contractors working on large government contracts, there are often, I don't want to say opportunities, but cost overruns that end up happening. In the most recent quarter, there was a big drag associated with a missile program. Talk a little bit about that and whether or not those losses are going to continue.
Yeah, about $100 million. This is for a classified missile program, so they don't actually tell you exactly what it is. They did telegraph that they anticipate about $224 million additional on top of that at some point this year. They were asked about this on the conference call by several analysts, and they kind of made it clear that 224 might actually be higher. Again, they would not quantify it. I did ask them about this when I had a chance to interview both the CFO and COO, and they said basically anticipate, quote, more volatility in some of those lost concessions for the rest of the year.
Well, what struck you the most in kind of, going through the earnings and then talking to these, two key top executives at the company? What struck you the most in the conversation, Romy?
I think the idea here that they see longer-term structural changes that are going to ultimately be a benefit for their business. They talk a lot about the various conflicts going on in the world right now and the missile and other capabilities. Remember, it's not just missiles, but it's a lot of the software that goes into these defense systems that they are a big maker of. And they talked a lot about how that longer term, that is where the opportunity is. They also pointed out there's only a handful of players in here that can do what they do.
But a lot of consolidation.
Yeah, it's Lockheed, RTX, and a couple other companies, and that's pretty much it.
I want to end with the F-35.
Yeah.
What update did we get on the F-35?
We got
no cost there.
We got no update on the
Speaking
F-35.
of cost overruns, right?
Yeah, I mean, they would not talk about this at all. They said, look, they're aware of the clawback that the Pentagon has already issued. But again, they said at the end of the day, that's not lost revenue. It's simply deferred revenue because once again, nobody else is going to deliver an F-35. It may come late, but they're the only ones who can deliver it.
This goes back to what you say. There's only, at this point, the industry has consolidated so much that there's only a few players.
Yeah.
And once you commit to a program, right, you're kind of committed on something like this.
Absolutely.
Interesting stuff. Thank you so much.
Hey, anytime for you too.
Anytime for you as well. As we said, Lockheed Martin shares, they did rally earlier in this session, but definitely that has kind of unwound as the day has gone on. So just a little change at this hour.
Hey, we're still seeing stocks move higher as we get closer to the close. The S&P 500 up 1.3%, the NASDAQ Composite up 1.8%, the Dow up 0.7%. Of course, Tesla happening after the bell today. Shares of Tesla right now higher by 2.3%.
And speaking of the close, Romaine will be leading the close coming up next on Bloomberg Television. So that's coming your way in just about 10 minutes time. Coming up for us here at Business Week, we're going to talk a little bit about drone racing. It's apparently a thing. John Tucker knows about it. This is what he does on the weekends.
So into it.
You know about drone racing?
I don't know about drone racing.
Right,
I'd like to stick around for that. My show can wait.
Well, it's a thing, guys. We're going to get into it. That's our one more thing coming your way in just a moment.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom with a look at some of the company stories we're following. Let's start with lobbying. The 10 biggest lobbying entities this year included the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Meta Platforms. They spent a combined $90 million to influence the federal government on tax, tech, and healthcare policy as lawmakers debate legislation dealing with online privacy and kid safety. Meta posted its top spending quarter ever, $7.6 million to influence. That's according to a recently filed lobbying disclosure covering the first 3 months of the year. And the union that represents Boeing employees says the company retaliated against 2 engineers who raised concerns about the 777 and 787 jets in 2022. One of those engineers left Boeing. The other filed a formal retaliation complaint. The union says the plane maker gave identical negative evaluations to the workers who had actually been designated as representatives of the Federal Aviation Administration, and who they asked Boeing to reevaluate engine work on the wide-body jets. Remember Meadowlark Lemon and Curly Neal?
Yeah, the Globetrotters.
Actually, Tim's like shaking his head.
Right? Am I
He
right?
doesn't remember. That's before your time. Harlem Globetrotters International. It's actually a company, yes. They say the Small Business Administration improperly denied them $10 billion under the program to support live entertainment businesses affected by the pandemic. Basic administrative law requirement is that an agency has to provide reasons for the decision, and they say the Small Business Administration gave no formal reason for denying the award funds. Yeah, they're still around. Harlem. Unfortunately, Curly and Meadowlark, they're playing in that big arena in the sky. They're no longer with us. That is your company news,
shot, by the
Tim.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The Senate has enough votes now to advance that $95 billion package, providing funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke before the vote.
A few days ago, the House of Representatives at long last approved essential national security funding for Ukraine, for Israel, for the Indo-Pacific, and for humanitarian assistance. Today is the Senate's turn to act.
The package includes a measure that would force ByteDance to divest its ownership of TikTok or face a ban in the U.S. Columbia University's main campus is switching to hybrid learning for the rest of this semester because of protests over Israel's war with Hamas. New York City Police Department Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters, Mike Gerber.
They informed us that they had students who were trespassing. They asked us to come onto campus to take action, and we did.
Demonstrations are cropping up on university campuses across the U.S. Court is adjourned in this day 2 of testimony in the Donald Trump hush money criminal trial. The first witness was the former publisher of the National Enquirer, David Pecker, who told the court about how he would, quote, help the campaign at Trump's request to cover up sex scandals during the 2016 campaign. The judge has not officially ruled on that. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. All right, now to our one more thing this hour, and this has to do
You've
with
been wanting to talk about this since early this morning.
drone racing,
Big
man.
drone racing
We've actually
fan.
bought our drone at home, and we haven't played with it yet.
You have a drone?
We have a
Are they
drone.
allowed in your neighborhood?
No, but you take it out sailing when you're way
That's
out in the
exactly.
ocean, and then you can go up and like watch whales.
And we've been
or
out in the
whatever.
water, and it's like all of a sudden you hear something buzzing above you, and it's a little.
It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a drone.
All right, to the story we
Okay.
go. Drone racing, a once a niche hobby, has become the latest sports play after the Drone Racing League was acquired by metaverse firm Infinite Reality for $250 million.
What?
Yeah,
That's not even- yeah.
Quarter of $1 billion?
Yeah, there's money in drone racing apparently. Here's the metaverse
drones.
connection. Okay,
Yeah.
so the drone racers fly quadcopters, that aircraft with 4 propellers.
Right.
Often pilots wear VR goggles. And in those VR goggles, they get a feed from the camera embedded on the drone.
We're
and
showing
they maneuver it as if they were in a craft itself in order to steer it. It's pretty cool stuff.
John, you
can see
said
up
go out
there.
to malls and you see like drone racing, right?
Yeah, empty malls. They go out and race the
they are
drones
fast.
there because it's like there are a lot of obstacles in the empty malls, and
You don't want to be hitting people that are shopping, right?
What
It's gonna be-
That actually
Empty
would
malls.
be kind of cool, actually. I'd
Welcome
watch
to
that.
Captain Obvious. You would watch that. You are crazy.
There were some big investors in the drone racing.
I love this part of the story.
RSE Ventures.
Yeah, DRL. Oh, you're talking about DRL?
Yeah.
Founded in 2015, primarily backed by investors including RSE Ventures. That's the venture firm founded by Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross. Other investors include Liberty Media, T-Mobile, CAA Ventures, and Lux Capital.
Very cool stuff.
Yeah. DRL too has partnerships. Did you see this with the U.S. Air Force,
Yes.
Google Cloud, Allianz, NBC, Sony, and a blockchain tech company?
You gotta start practicing.
Are you
with your
gonna
drone
Are you gonna race?
and race?
I don't know. We just got to get it up in the air. Like you got to.
Step one, get in air.
He did something and it landed poorly. You know. Sorry, John.
I see one of your neighbors getting really seriously hurt by you.
We got to work on that. All right. Listen, for those of you watching on television, the close is coming up next. For those watching on Bloomberg Business Week, Tim, we're going to count you down on those Tesla earnings.
Yeah, we are. Also, we're going to talk about the rally and talk about this sidecar that Joe referred to. What's going on with the TikTok ban in this latest measure?
And the everything war, Amazon's ruthless quest to own the world and remake corporate power, is the subject of a new book. It's all next.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just 1 hour away from the closing bell on this Tuesday, April 23rd. Carol Messer, Tim Stenevec live here on Bloomberg Business Week. And we've got a bit of a rally underway. Even Tesla shares are up higher today.
Yeah, it's just like yesterday what we saw. The S&P 500 up by 1.2%, the Nasdaq Composite up by 1.8%, the Dow up by 0.7%, I should say. We're going to talk about that rally, fundamentals, technicals with our chief markets correspondent in just a second. And Carol, it's TikTok for TikTok.
Yeah, but our Bloomberg Opinion columnist asks, if TikTok is such a threat, show us the receipts. It's a great story
I can think of some parents who have some receipts.
But is the U.S. being a little hypocritical when it comes back to kind of limitations? And then, I don't know, we got a lot to unpack in this one. Tesla, we're going to talk about that, the stock being in no man's land. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but after the earnings, we're going to get into the results, the outlook. We've got someone who's been an investor in shares of Tesla, has owned Tesla shares. Ross Gerber is going to be back with us.
Own Tesla cars as well.
Oops,
looking forward to that protest. Yes. Also, Columbia University officials are planning on holding a briefing on an ongoing campus situation a little later. We're going to talk about anti-Israel protests spreading from Columbia to Yale to MIT. We're going to get the latest from our higher education finance reporter.
Yeah, one of our most read. And then a new book. It's getting into Amazon and what it kind of is looking to do when it comes to kind of owning the world and remaking corporate power. It's pretty...
Is it a monopoly?
That we're going to try to answer. First up, though, let's get a check on the trade. Someone is looking at me like, I don't know, but he does know what's going on in the markets. John Tucker is back with us.
Well, yeah, we'll see. Technology shares helping push the broader market higher. All of the members of the Magnificent Seven, they're up today. 4 members of that cohort, they report earnings this week. And yes, after the bell, it starts with Tesla. Those shares, they are up right now, 2.1%. Overall, about 180 companies report this week. That represents 40% of the S&P 500 market value. Seema Shah's chief global strategist at Principal Global Investors. This is how she sizes up the market right now.
We do need the earnings story to be fairly positive in order to reinforce a bit of the market rally. Now, the economic data, I mean, the economic backdrop is really strong. That seems to be very clear. So earnings should be fairly solid, but of course, expectations are fairly lofty for some segments of the market. So there is potential for disappointment.
Globe Life right now, the best performing individual stock in the S&P 500, up over 12%. It's an insurance company raising its operating earnings per share forecast for the full year. A worst performing stock, that belongs to MSCI, down 14%. The investment company reporting operating revenue and operating income that missed analyst estimates. Right now, the S&P 500 up 57 points. That's a rise of 1.1%, 5,068 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 237 points. That's up 0.6%. The Nasdaq Composite Index, that's up 253 points. That is a rise of 1.6%. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Carol and Tim.
Thank you so much for that update, John. Do appreciate it. Well, we've been talking about the rally, and you just heard an update from John Tucker about it. Tech heavyweights lifting the broader stock market again. Every member of the Mag 7 mega caps rising today, rebounding after a sell-off, Carol, that sent the market to its worst week in over a year. Tesla reports after the close, we should note, also halting a 7-day losing streak.
All right, so more on the trade. Let's get to it. Tesla and everything else. Back with us is Bloomberg News Chief Markets Correspondent Abigail Doolittle here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Good to have you back with us. Love kind of tracking kind of where we are as we are getting ready for some really big earnings. Another day, another rally, and it's holding.
Yeah, we do. Over the last 2 days, we're now up 2% for the S&P 500. That's the best 2 days in 2 months. So what makes that interesting is we've been such in rally mode that I think that stat would surprise most people because it feels like the sell-off was more recent. And it's true, the sell-off, the heart of it has been over the last 3 weeks, but trends take time to shift. So I'm looking at a chart that I'm going to do my very best to describe, which is the S&P 500 essentially started to reverse its uptrend at the very beginning of March. And that's essentially why this is the last, these are the 2 days that are matched by the end of February. But we still went higher even as that uptrend started to reverse. That tells you that those buyers were very exhausted. They didn't really know what they're doing. And I would say on the way down now here, the charts look pretty heavy. I think on the S&P 500, there's a good chance we go to, let's call it 5,100, 5,120, and then I think we go right back down probably toward 48, 4,700.
What do you mean when the chart looks kind of heavy? Do you mean pushing it to the
candles,
downside?
they just, the way that they're positioned, the 2 day yesterday, even though yesterday was an up day, when it's positioned with some of the other candles, it just looks like there's gravitas there, for lack of a better way to put it. It doesn't look like the buyers feel good about buying. It almost looks like panic buying or brief relief rally.
Could strong earnings from big tech companies over the next week or so change that narrative?
So it certainly could. And so what would need to happen for that to be the case is if the S&P 500 were to go above its 50-day moving average, let's just call it 5120, which is that level I was just saying that I think that we probably go up toward there, maybe a little bit above and then back down. That would certainly be on strong earnings. On the other hand, if this downward trend holds, and the reason I expect it to hold is if you were to see it, it expands. A good channel is just two parallel lines. This is expanding to the outside. It is, the two lines are going away from each other. That points to massive uncertainty and lack of information on the part of the investor. So when that's happening to the downside, it's just not a good thing generally, because the selling is just a little bit chaotic, again, uncertainty. So I would say, based on looking at this chart at this moment, that it's more likely that there's going to be something about earnings that investors don't like. And I would say it's probably going to be this week as opposed to next. Now, that said, again, if we go above 5120, 5130, 5140 with conviction on a weekly close, well, the story may change. As the Fed always talks about, the data may change at that point.
I always love to ask you about volume.
Yes.
Where are we?
Let me take a look, because I actually have not looked yet. So I'm pulling it up very quickly. I'm using the AVAT function on the Bloomberg terminal. And so it is above average. We started off 10% below the last 20 days average volume. Right now we're about 3% above, so not wildly above, but that's healthier than less healthy. It means that the buyers, that there is a degree of seriousness to it.
All right, good stuff. As always, so appreciated. Great market perspective. Bloomberg News Chief Markets Correspondent Abigail Doolittle right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio.
Well, we spent a good portion of our program earlier talking about the sweeping foreign aid package making its way through the Capitol with emergency supplemental funding for Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific region. Another part of the measure would also require TikTok's Chinese owner to divest the video sharing app, and that's where we want to go now.
Yeah, we do, and we've got a great roundtable to do it. Bloomberg News technology reporter Alex Barinka and Bloomberg Opinion U.S. technology columnist Dave Lee are both here with us. Both of them have been all over this story from the very beginning. Alex joining us out there in our L.A. bureau. Dave is right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Alex, let me start with you. We've been talking so much about this measure making its way through the Senate, through lawmakers. It does have this provision for TikTok and a ban specifically. Let me just go to it. Sanctions, the TikTok sanctions, Russian assets, other language. That's kind of the other fourth chunk of it. Long way, though, before we would see TikTok banned here in the United States.
certainly if this bill does get signed into law, which a lot of folks who are watching the progression of it think will happen as soon as this week, there would be about a year for ByteDance to have some kind of separation from TikTok. That is ByteDance, TikTok's Chinese parent company, who under this law would be forced to basically sell its stake. It is a company in a foreign adversary country. China has laws that potentially can allow for data from ByteDance to be seen by the Chinese government. Those are the heart of the concerns from the Senate. But I will tell you, if this law does pass and does force ByteDance to go through some separation, that's not the end of the fight. Our sources familiar with the thinking both at ByteDance and TikTok have said that this is going to head to the courts first before ByteDance will be willing to just easily throw up its hands and say, hey, yeah, sure, we'll get rid of this really valuable asset.
Yeah, when you've got 170 million U.S. users, you don't just walk away from it. Dave, let's bring you into this. Should there even be a fight at all? Because we do wonder about, is the U.S., as you write in your column, a little bit being, hypocritical in terms of the pushback against TikTok. How are you seeing it? How are you thinking about it?
Well, I think one of the big questions about how this entire episode has happened is, the nature of which this has been very, very quickly moved through the process, through the House, through the Senate, as we've just seen today, without much scrutiny of what exactly the concern about TikTok is. Now, there's one framing of the app as being, and I think I described it this way in the piece, as like a coiled spring, right? A method by which China, should they ever want to, be able to sort of exert this extreme influence over many people in America, 170 million users, many of them young users as well that might be receptive to certain messaging. However, we haven't actually seen evidence of that happening. And while we've heard a lot of discussion around how senators and representatives have had these briefings, these kind of behind closed doors briefings, I think it's going to take a little bit more to convince the public that this was a move done for those reasons. And also, as we were just hearing from Alex, this is going to go to the courts. And the question there is going to be, why is this not something that tramples the free speech rights of the users of TikTok? What is the national security argument? Let's see it.
Well, Alex, how would proponents of a bill to ban TikTok in the U.S. respond to what Dave was just talking about? What is the national security argument here?
Like he said, it's been kind of a trust us, it's scary type of argument. You've heard folks say that, the government could get its hands on sensitive user data, things like your name, your address, what you're interested in, where your location is. They also have gone down this path, like Dave was talking about, around influence, saying, hey, well, the Chinese government could influence what these vulnerable young minds could see. But on both sides of those issues, we haven't heard a lot from lawmakers. We've actually heard also from some lawmakers who have been in these closed-door briefings who said what they're hearing is really similar to their experience actually on other social media apps who are not owned by a Chinese parent company. As this does go to the courts, I think Dave's question is the right one. When are we going to see the proof, and is that the right venue? I will remind you guys, I think we talked about it a month ago when we published the story in Business Week. There was a 1965 Supreme Court case where the U.S. Postal Service was trying to limit Chinese propaganda going to American users. And SCOTUS actually ruled that Americans have every right to see Chinese propaganda and the government cannot intervene. So depending on kind of which legal battle lands where, there's an expectation that there could be several different arguments that are pushed against this bill if it's signed into law. We might see some onus on the government to sort of justify some of these things depending on what TikTok or other plaintiffs like creators or merchants, whoever ends up in those legal battles, whatever argument they bring forward, we might need to see some proof for the judicial system to work things out.
Dave, I also do wonder this whole idea. I feel like freedom of speech is just really a big issue we're trying to kind of grapple with in the U.S. with it, or globally, really, in a social media world. Having said that, I'm trying to figure out what the real issue is. Is it that China can just peep into things and have access to the information? As you say, China could save itself a lot of time and effort by buying America's data from the many shady brokers happy to sell it to them. So there's a lot of information already out there. And to be fair, many would argue the U.S. government also is tapping into things and accessing a lot of data on its adversaries.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the parts of this debate that comes up is that, China doesn't allow US apps to become popular.
Proliferate here in the United States.
Popular in China. So, there is this sort of back and forth here on this. I argue in the column that, America likes to think it holds itself to a higher standard than China on these kind of things, which is historically has been true. But, the question of user data, a lot of it comes down to the algorithm that TikTok has, right? This is, the most lucrative algorithm in the world. And it's interesting that even if TikTok was to be sold to a US owner, China has signaled that the algorithm wouldn't be part of that sale. And so the question might then be, well, what value is the app anyway, even if it was to be divested, which, any buyer would be very, very aware of the fact that they weren't getting the secret source of what TikTok is.
Alex, come in on this. I do think we're grappling with this idea of, data, who owns it, who gets access to it, and freedom of information, or not freedom of information, but freedom of speech. Help me out in how you're seeing this and how it's kind of working its way through the global tech industry.
Yeah, it's kind of happening both in TikTok's argument, who's saying, look, if we want to protect users, we need to have comprehensive data privacy policy and not just you guys coming after us and fighting on ownership issues. Obviously, the likes of some of TikTok's biggest competitors are not always the friendliest to the idea of new legislation. I'll also point to what I've seen from users. I've been spending a lot of time on TikTok per usual. It is my job. And a lot of folks are really upset that they feel like the government is getting in the way of a place that they feel is very amicable to regular people going viral and talking on the app. TikTok kind of changed the game to that extent. So when it comes down to this kind of freedom of speech argument, I'm also very fascinated to see how people take this bill, if it becomes law, going into the election. Are they looking at who their legislators are, who the president is, Joe Biden, who would be the one signing this, and taking that into account as they sign this bill? And also, does TikTok maybe try to wait until there's a friendlier administration? Donald Trump, the president who signed the first executive order to ban the app, has now since changed his tune, saying the app should probably stay in America, and those are his feelings these days. So that argument will be one that I'm sure will come up, particularly in the eyes of users and in the eyes of TikTok, who will take this to the courts.
Hey, Dave, I'm wondering in your reporting in the column that you wrote, the idea of this is not necessarily part of the ban, but one thing that I hear from parents all the time is that it's completely addictive. The algorithm serves up content that I don't necessarily want my kid to see all the time. And there are arguments, and I don't know to what extent that these are baseless arguments, about how the Chinese version of TikTok, Douyin, serves different content than what Americans see on the ByteDance TikTok version here in the U.S.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever actually been backed up by sort of firm data on the differences. Suggestion, on Douyin, you're getting things about math and science, and whereas on TikTok, you're getting
people love to talk about that,
jokes.
But I've yet to see proof of that.
Yes, same. I mean, I think it's an interesting thought that could possibly be happening. I think one of the things that is striking to me about how many of the people on TikTok are viewing this, and like Alex, it's my job. That's my excuse I use for using TikTok all the time as well.
All right, 99.9% is for work.
Absolutely.
That 0.1% might be for your own fun and games.
But the reaction is many of them are saying, well, hold on, there's a bill to protect children online that's currently stalled in Congress. There's another bill to put a data privacy law on the books, finally in America, that seems like a big struggle to get that passed as well. I think many people look at this and say, why is it that this issue, the TikTok issue, has flown through like nothing else, and yet these fundamental laws that could protect users more broadly have just sort of time and time again just slowed right up.
I just want to be compensated for all my data that's helping people. Alex, one last thought, and Dave has this in his story, that it's interesting, we do this all the time. We wonder about the folks in Washington, no disrespect, lawmakers, but whether they really understand it. And Dave, you put in your story a senator asking Mark Zuckerberg, how does Facebook make money? Or when TikTok CEO was asked whether the app connects to home Wi-Fi. So there is this understanding that maybe not everybody understands how it all works. Last 30 seconds. Is that important, that maybe they're not so up on it, the lawmakers?
Users think it's really important. They think that, again, this is a place where folks have been there to be able to share their mind. And they feel like the government is taking away a place where a lot of the TikTok users feel like they're getting kind of a unvetted, raw view of what's happening in the world, and it's a kind of platform for them to share their thoughts. So certainly those kind of questions turn heads for users of TikTok.
And Facebook makes money by advertising, by the way, and no, you cannot connect it to your home Wi-Fi.
And by selling a few.
Yes, you can.
A few Meta Quest headsets, too.
Alex Barenka, Dave Lee, we wanted to do this roundtable. You did it so well. Thank you so much. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks are higher, extending the two-day rally. Major averages right around the session highs. Equities heading toward their biggest back-to-back advance in about 2 months. So this comes after the sell-off that sent the S&P 500 down about 5% earlier this month. Right now, NVIDIA leading a surge in chip-making stocks. Shares of NVIDIA, they are up 3.7% at this point. Well, besides Tesla, Microsoft, Meta Platforms, and Alphabet due to report earnings this week. The so-called Magnificent Seven, that cohort opening their books to investors this week. And, of course, as we said a million times so far today, Tesla reports after the close of regular trading today. And those shares in advance of that up 1 3/4%. Earnings, they continue to be in the driver's seat for the most part. United Parcel Service, we're going to call that an economic barometer, reporting profit that beat estimates. And they have the Russell 2000 index of small caps. Right now, the Russell is up 1.9%. And yes, an auction. Treasury's $69 billion sale of 2-year notes, alluring solid buyer demand. The 2-year yield 4 basis points lower. That means the price is up. The yield 492. S&P 500, 57 points, 58 points higher, up 1.1%, 5,068 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 240 points. The Nasdaq Composite Index 254 points higher. That's up 1.7%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Carolyn Tim.
Thank you so much, JT. All right.
Well, last week, leaders at Columbia University called in the cops to clear pro-Palestinian demonstrators who want the school to exit all investments that benefit Israel's government. Instead of clearing the protesters, the crackdown has further fired up students who continue to occupy parts of the campus and inspired similar protests at other elite institutions such as Yale University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Janet Lauren is Bloomberg News higher education finance reporter. She joins us from New York. Janet, what started last week, or I should say started over the last few months, has really ballooned in the last few weeks and then in recent days spread to other college campuses. Explain what exactly is happening when it comes to the way that colleges are attempting to deal with this.
Hi, Tim and Carol. Well, as we've seen, this has been a heated issue that we've talked about for more than 6 months now. And we've seen protests, and as you mentioned, Columbia called the police, and several peers have joined in calling the police, and students are being arrested. Yale arrested about 60 people, about close to 50 of them students, and overnight NYU arrested over 100 people, protesters, presumably most of them students. So it's interesting that, we're sort of entering another phase. The school year is close to being done. And you're seeing more protests, more counter protests, and, everything. People were at Columbia yesterday, concerned about anti-Semitism. The governor was there. The mayor has spoken out about it. And it feels like we're in a bit of a different time.
I was thinking about when you were putting this story together, it is one of our most read. I think it's the second or third most read story on the Bloomberg all day today. And it obviously is something we've all been following very closely and watching in the newsroom. I mean, some of us have covered protests in the past, and they were often calm protests, and they would go on, and universities embraced students having the right to do so. Something's happened, Janet, at universities, and as you reported this out, it's no longer about calm protesting and different people expressing their point of view. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think people are feeling it very personally. And I think that's why, for example, you saw a bunch of members of Congress go up to Columbia the other day just to see it for themselves. And people talk about protests against the Vietnam War. That was a very famous time for protesting. I think Governor Hochul mentioned that, but this seems to be a very different tenor. And, when you talk about investing in endowments, this is a topic we've talked about extensively. This is something that protesters are mentioning, divesting. Endowments are very complicated. And it took me many years to understand how private equity works. And the idea that colleges have pretty much said, we're not discussing how we invest our money and how we invest anything. And I think that may be also frustrating for students to understand, well, you don't just press a button and all of a sudden things are changed in your endowment. They're very complicated. And if you're also invested in index funds, it's all of the S&P stocks. And I think those are difficult concepts for students to understand. These are everything we're talking about with the war is difficult. And the question is, are students are they interested in engaging? Are they interested in in protesting.
One thing that these colleges and universities have talked about and have mentioned is that certain student groups and certain students don't feel safe on campus right now. Who are those groups, and typically right now, and how are the universities using that as a way to sort of rationalize how they're working with these protesters or treating these protesters?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, I think a lot of the rhetoric seems to be anti-Semitic, and students are not comfortable, walking by encampments where they perhaps may not feel safe. And I think that is the issue that we're dealing with. And the reason why, for example, NYU, you see some photos and videos of the protests. The NYPD talked about bottles being thrown. The tenor definitely feels like it has changed. And, in these months after the war, it has been an unusual time on college campuses. And I think schools are trying to grapple with free speech versus, hate speech. And we're seeing a difference in how they're dealing with.
Well, that's what
And there's a couple of weeks.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please finish.
Well, we're just going to say there's a couple of weeks left, and it's been a challenging year for a lot of people. And I think perhaps everyone is hoping, to in some ways, maybe the year will try to end on a note that is, better than it has been.
I wondered, Janet, right? We've all seen the heads of major academic institutions, before members of Congress. I do wonder, though, as you report this out, is it about money? We've seen big donors, big alumni with deep pockets, who have certainly come out and spoken against various leaders, pulled maybe support. But is it about money? Is it about academic freedom? Is it about student safety? Is it about hate speech? Is it about discrimination? Is it about being a humanitarian, about having a voice? We've talked, I keep stealing from a producer of ours, when you're going to college, it's an opportunity to make mistakes and hopefully come to a better way of thinking about things, maybe more open mind. So what is all of this about, or is it all of the above? Or,
It is definitely all of the above. And I think when you go to college, you hope that you're going to come out better and more educated on the other end to learn how to have discourse and to speak with adults and peers and then presumably head into the workforce where you learn these skills that you're able to do this as well. And I think people are also questioning that. They're questioning the value of, they're spending quite a lot of money at some of these schools. Mm-hmm. And what are kids learning? Are they learning how to deal with difficulty? Because, you're certainly going to have a lot of difficulty in your life. And, academic discourse. How do you have a debate with somebody? And perhaps that's a question that, people are feeling. Are these kids learning how to have that debate?
But is the money getting in the way?
Well, the money is a huge issue. I mean, look at the cost of these colleges. Yeah. Look at parents are paying for it. They're borrowing. Students have jobs. It's not easy to get through college, even at these elite universities. It is a lot of money.
Janet, you mentioned that the pro-Palestinian demonstrators want the school to exit all investments that benefit Israel's government. What does that mean? What's the definition of benefiting Israel's government?
That's an excellent question. Are they, and I'm not sure anyone really knows the answer to that. Colleges are famous for not sharing what they're investing in. And if they do, we know they're invested with this type of private equity fund, but the portfolio companies are not always quite visible. So it's a good question.
I mean, does it mean, it can mean I would imagine it could mean many different things. Does it mean companies that sell products and services in Israel? Is it companies that are defense contractors, like here in the United States, Carol, that sell weapons to the country? I mean, the definition could be very broad.
I agree. And I think this is what Janet's saying, right, Janet, that there isn't a lot of transparency about it. But it is interesting that, again, I go back to money kind of complicating it, right? And necessary for these major institutions, academic institutions, I guess, to really kind of keep up and running and spend like they need to or say they need to. But it gets complicated, and it does wonder, when an academic institution, maybe through its investments, supports something, right? Like what that means and why students would be upset.
Well, you know, we hear this about climate change, and that's a great issue, that students are extremely concerned about climate change. And it's not just students. There's lots of concern about what's going on with climate change. And what are colleges investing in direct stocks? Are they investing in private equity funds that invest in oil-related things? When you go back to the divestment movement from South Africa, it was a very different time in investing. Most colleges owned plain vanilla stocks. So when they made a decision to divest from companies that did business in South Africa, they were actually American companies that were doing business in South Africa. You know, Michigan State University was the first university to divest, and you know, we're talking about businesses that ran in Michigan.
Yeah.
So that is easy.
Yeah. It's complicated, no doubt about it. We'll have more conversations, no doubt. We've got to run. Janet, thank you, though. Janet Lauren, she's Bloomberg News higher education finance reporter. Hey, coming up, we're going to get into the new defensives in investing.
Hey, first, though, a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 Newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. The Senate has enough votes to advance that $95 billion package providing funding to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby says the aid can't come soon enough.
It's not going in the Ukrainians' favor in the Donbass, certainly not elsewhere in the country. Mr. Putin thinks he can play for time, so we've got to try to make up some of that time.
National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby. Meanwhile, Russia has threatened to step up strikes on Ukraine in response to any U.S. approval of military aid to the government in Kyiv. Columbia University's main campus switching to hybrid learning for the rest of this semester because of protests over Israel's war with Hamas that have roiled colleges across the country. University officials say they based the decision on ensuring the safety of students, faculty, and staff.
It's just hard to see that we have reached such a point where we can't talk to each other. We can't interact in normal ways that we should be able to interact.
Students have protested Israel's war in Gaza at many campuses across the country in recent weeks. Court is adjourned in day 2 of testimony in the Donald Trump hush money criminal trial. The first witness was the former publisher of the National Enquirer, David Pecker, who told the court about how he could, quote, help the campaign at Trump's request to cover up sex scandals during the 2016 campaign. Also, the judge did not issue an immediate ruling, but it does look like Donald Trump may be found in contempt of court for violating a gag order. And a little fun news for you. Archaeologists say they have found 2 perfectly preserved bottles at George Washington's home. They found the 2 bottles filled with cherries at his Mount Vernon estate dating back to the 1770s. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Around session highs for the major averages. Of course, Tesla kicking off earnings for the Magnificent Seven. That happens after the close of regular trading in New York. Tesla expected to report the first quarterly sales drop since the pandemic struck. It's also seen posting the steepest earnings per share decline year over year in the Magnificent Seven. At least that's according to estimates compiled by Bloomberg Intelligence. Right now, Tesla shares, despite that, up 1.9%. Stocks are pushing higher. Again, all the major averages up. 10 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 are advancing. NVIDIA shares leading the semiconductor stocks. NVIDIA shares right now up 3.75%. And we also had some data today. Business activity expanding in April at the slowest pace this year. That came on a pullback in demand, so that helps the view that the Fed will have to cut rates. Right now, the 2-year also had an auction of treasuries today. 2-year, 4 basis points lower, 492. S&P 500 right now is up 60 points, a rise of 1.2% at 5,071. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 270 points. That is a rise of 0.7%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 257 points. That's a rise of 1.7%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, just got about 18 minutes left in today's trading session. Getting ready to wrap shortly the Tuesday trade. Having said that, our next guest says large profitable tech companies are beneficiaries of higher interest rates. She goes so far to call them the new defensive companies. And yes, folks, she means companies like Apple, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and Alphabet. So let's get to it.
We're talking about none other than Nancy Tangler, CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Laffer Tangler Investments. Also the author of The Women's Guide to Successful Investing. She's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So the new defensive, typically when we see rates go up, the large, a lot of tech companies, particularly unprofitable tech companies, move lower. But why tech overall? Is it because of just the cash that they have on their balance sheets?
Well, thank you for that intro.
You're welcome.
I think the secular narrative is a tailwind for these companies, and we're going to hear about that with AI in the coming earnings reports, and how much it is impacting earnings. But yeah, I mean, if you look at a company like Meta, their interest earned on cash went up threefold. Google went up 78%, and the leader in this pack...
That's real money.
It's real money. And the leader in this pack is Microsoft, which had a blowout second quarter last year and has continued to accumulate cash. And then you sort of add to that the fact that nobody can get any M&A through this FTC. I think you're going to start to see some return of capital to shareholders.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I feel like there's momentum, I think, courtesy of you. I think Abigail Doolittle.
Oh, that's what I was thinking when I asked the question. Our own Abigail Doolittle, Chief Markets Correspondent, mentioned this a couple of weeks ago about the cash that these companies have on hand and the way it's generating money.
Well, in a higher rate environment, that means something, right? And so they're not as problematic. You're a smaller company in a higher rate environment. You don't have that access to cash so easily because you probably are going to need to tap debt markets, if you will. These guys don't. They're actually okay. All right. Having said that, then how do you think about, do you buy them when there's a little bit of a pullback? What's the role in the portfolio? Do you buy all of them? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I don't think you buy all of them, Carol. But I will say this. We were trimming the names in February. We didn't know the market was going to peak in March. And we're pretty disciplined in that regard.
Yeah.
When things get overweighted, we trim. I mean, I could make an argument
just
that
an overweighted call that you would trim back.
Yeah,
okay.
or valuation. But I could make a case, and as I do in my book, that you probably should never trim. I mean, all the great wealth has come from one stock in a founder's portfolio. But that's what we do as professional money managers. We've been back in adding to some of the names after this pullback correction, whatever you want to call it, because I do think that they're well positioned, and it goes back to our analogy of the 90s. You know, we have so many similarities, ex-globalization to the 1990s, and I think the most important of that is productivity. And like old economy company Raytheon reported today, they're going to report $200 million in productivity improvements this year, and a lot of that is because they're digitizing their factories and connecting them. That stuff really matters, and it's going to be what drives earnings growth, and we think that's the only thing that matters, and the Fed matters a lot less.
Which stocks are you buying right now? Where are you adding?
We've been adding to names like Oracle. We will be adding to Lam after they report, because it's been pretty disappointing in the chip space.
Why wait until after they report?
Just because we think there's probably a little bit more room to the downside, and it gives you clarity. But we are in many of these names at much lower levels. We've added to Microsoft. We've added to Google pretty significantly. And when you ask me this question, it's like in my head. Oh, and Adobe we've been adding to on the weakness, and Palo Alto Networks, which sold off 28% after the last earnings report.
I don't hear Tesla.
We will be.
You will be.
What level?
Yes. Talk to us about this.
Okay, so I mean, it's not the stock and Spotify, by the way, it's not the stock I really want to defend, but you know, this is a CEO who thrives in chaos. And the last time that it was this bad, the company didn't even have earnings. I bought the stock at 180.
Did you buy Spotify? Oh, but keep going. No, finish on Tesla. Sorry.
Carol,
yes,
Carol.
I know. Focus. Go ahead. Nancy,
We bought it about 180 pre-splits.
Tesla.
And then he was smoking pot on the Joe Rogan show, drinking whiskey. People were quitting. The board was just super not independent. He was sleeping on the factory floor. You remember, right?
Yeah,
we
quote, unquote,
sold it.
production
Like,
hell.
I felt like it was gambling. as it
Every
was
move
investing.
we've documented.
Yeah. So I took a double, and the stock's up 555% since then, including the recent pullback. So we added to the stock a year ago. We reinitiated it at about $104 a share. We sold some when it got in the 200s. We bought some a little bit too soon at 180. And at current levels, we think a lot of the bad news is priced in. And the last thing I'll say about it, it's only trading as an EV company, but the really interesting part of the business is the utility grade battery pack business, which is growing 50% a year and will dwarf the EV business at about $120 billion in market valuation in about 5 years.
Is there anything that comes off of the earnings tonight that would make you, I don't know, either buy, sell, or do something?
Well, I mean,
I don't know.
I don't think
you don't sound like you're very reactionary that way.
No, I don't think Elon Musk could say anything that would surprise me. If by chance Donald Trump gets invested, I think he will no longer, Elon that is, be the man that everyone should hate, and we'll go back to parsing the tweets of another well-known, outspoken. Yeah.
I'm going to go back to Spotify. Surging today, swing to profit, boosting paid subscribers. You know, WOA, I forgot to do this as one of my gainers today, but it's up about 13%, was up as much as 17%. When were you guys buying it?
We bought in the high 80s, and this was a plan based on
today
the fact.
At 306.
Yeah,
wow.
Well, we sometimes get them right. We don't always get them right, but and we were just, you know, we were convinced that they had a lot of room to raise prices. They'd held the business, you know, they were able to grow it. This notion where they went out and made it a more open format so you can get the Joe Rogan podcast on other platforms, that was brilliant. That was a pivot. And I think that the management team should be commended. Now they've been able to stick a couple of price increases. Because they waited so long, I think it is even more impactful, as opposed to some of the names, the consumer names that came out today, they're still raising prices. You know, okay, EPS is up, but volumes are down. At some point, that party comes to an end.
What are you staying away from?
For the moment, we are underweight REITs. We're underweight utilities.
Are you tapping treasuries at all with the move up in rates?
Where
are you?
So personally, this is the first time I've ever owned a treasury in my entire life.
Wow.
We've been putting clients in short ladders, and we just started to extend duration a couple of weeks ago.
How far out?
2.
Okay.
We're not going very far out because we think there's an opportunity to morph into munis and corporates when the treasury short game is done. And so we've just been rolling these short ladders, and it's worked out pretty